What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another Retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and this one is going to be very, very exciting because we have finally reached GOAT. We've gone through the entirety of the DM era, and now we're on the cusp of GX. But before we dive into GOAT format, and I've got some very fun plans for diving into GOAT format, so definitely look forward to that. We've got to cover the new cards and the new list that GOAT format introduced into the game. Because going from Warrior format to GOAT format, there were 2 booster sets that released, there were some promo cards that were added to the card pool, and there was a new limited list and forbidden list as well. So there are still cards banned, don't worry, that were introduced into the game. So let's all cover that and see what that might mean for GOAT format before actually diving into GOAT format proper. Now, we're going to go through every card that was introduced. Well, maybe not some of the normal monsters, but every card that actually has an effect and does something unique that was introduced to the game. And, we're going to go pretty in depth. So we're going to cover things that likely won't see any play in the format, but it should be a lot of fun. So I'm excited to go down that rabbit hole, see what else is out there, and hopefully we'll find some new cards together. But before we can dive into the cards themselves, let's talk about this new limited list, because this limited list was a very important step to making the GOAT format that we know and love today. If you remember from Warrior format's limited list, there were some cards that were legal in GOAT that were banned in that, namely Graceful Charity and Delinquent Duo. And there were also some cards that were illegal in GOAT that were legal in that. So let's start by talking about the new bans and talk about how that makes the formats a bit different. Before we go into the new bans, though, some of the old bans are still the same. CED is still banned. That's very good because this card is very degenerate. Definitely the stronger of the 2 Chaos monsters in that it can just end the game out of nowhere. So very good to see this banned, which is also still banned, as searching a beater can be very, very strong off a card like this, so I get why they banned it. Yadagrasu also banned, likely for the Chaos Yadalock, so there's take that out of the game entirely. I think this card probably could be legal in GOAT without really too many ramifications, but I do think it's fine to have it on the ban list here. Also, now getting into the cards that were legal in Warrior format, we've got Magical Scientist banned. I think this is a pretty good hit overall. Scientist was a bit of a utility card in Warrior format where a lot of decks could use it to get out powerful fusion monsters and do things with that. But it also contributed to a nasty FTK that, it's probably better just to ban out of the format. Even though I don't think that FTK was really that powerful, it's just best to toss the card out and make it so that there's no access to that at all. We've also got Fiber Jar here. Fiber Jar, I think, was a pretty good balancing card for Warrior format, but I do get why it's banned here. It can be a bit annoying to have to reshuffle your deck constantly if people are just throwing down Fiber Jars. So getting this out of the way makes games a bit shorter often, and also sort of prevents that overwhelming advantage that one player can get if they've sort of got the priority to do things after the Fiber Jar resolves. So I do think that banning this card is not a bad decision. And lastly, we've got Makir the Destructor. This is a powerful monster that lets you activate traps from your hand once sent to the graveyard, and with some of the new additions from Flaming Eternity and the Lost Millennium, it probably is best that this got banned because there are some degenerate things that you can do with it. Moving on to the spells, we start off with 4 of the original Power 5 spells of the game's history: Raigeki, Dark Hole, Monster Reborn, and Change of Heart. Change of Heart is actually a new addition to this list here, as this was legal in Warrior format, but for GOAT format, there are more sort of monster-taking card effects, like Mind Control and Brain Control, so I do think it makes sense to ban this. You don't need this as well as those, and I do think the cards did very powerful overall, so I think it probably is good that it is banned on the list here. But beyond that, we've still got Harpy's Feather Duster on the list as well. This card's very, very good at clearing away your opponent's back row, while Heavy Storm can fill that role a bit. Heavy Storm, you have to play around it yourself, and it does take a bit more skillful play to make sure that you don't have a back row full when you want to go for the Heavy Storm. So I think that Duster is definitely the card to ban here, and you can leave Heavy at 1. Moving on to the new cards, though, from the banned spells, we've got Confiscation and Forceful Sentry here, taking the spot of Delinquent Duo. These cards are very, very good. They give you hand knowledge, while Duo just sort of gives you card advantage. So I do think that these cards are more powerful than Duo, and it makes sense why they're on the list here. Although I will say that they probably could have just banned all the hand rips. You don't need these two to be banned and then take off Duo because, like, oh, well, people demand to have one of the hand rips in the game. You could probably just ban them all because people generally don't like the hand rips. But they decided to experiment with it a little bit, so they're bringing back Duo, and that will be legal in GOAT format here. We're also got Mirage of Nightmare on the banned portion of this list. Mirage is very, very powerful. Makes sense why it's here. Also, not every deck could play it because, you know, you need to be able to support things like Raigeki Break because Mystical Space Typhoon is limited. So I do think that it makes sense to be here, as it does sort of really increase the power of certain decks that can support it, whereas decks that can't support it are at a bit of a disadvantage. So I think it does make sense to ban it here. We've also got Painful Choice banned. Painful Choice, very, very powerful card. Can set up the graveyard. Very skill-intensive card too. But because of its high power level, I think it does make sense to be banned here, especially when it can set up chaos plays, and you don't necessarily want to enable chaos more than it already is. Lastly, we've got Butterfly Dagger Elma. I don't really think this necessarily needed to be on the list, but kind of like Scientist, it can enable certain FTKs. For instance, with Royal Magical Library and Gearfried, basically you just keep equipping the dagger to the Gearfried, keep getting counters on Royal Magical Library, and then you can draw through your entire deck. It doesn't happen that often. It's a bit of a rare curse, especially given that Monster Reborn is banned now, and also Mercurial the Destructor is banned, so you can't really, you know, easily bring out a Royal Magical Library and a Gearfried on the field at the same time. But I do think it probably is better safe than sorry just to ban this card entirely. Lastly, for the banned cards, we've got Imperial Order. Thank goodness this is banned. I mean, this card is incredibly, incredibly toxic, and it's definitely one of the most hated cards of the DM era because it just shuts down your opponent's spells to one-sided floodgate so you can shut it off when you want to use your spells, and it's just very, very brutal to deal with. So I think that it definitely deserves to still be banned. Moving on to the limited cards, starting with the monsters, we've got, of course, the 5 pieces of Exodia. These are mainly here for flavor reasons. Realistically, if you unbanned all of these, it wouldn't really make a difference in GOAT format. I don't think the deck would be any more powerful than it is now. But I do think that it's cool that for the flavor of this, that all these cards are limited, so you can only play 1 copy each. Moving on to the actual powerful monsters on this list, we've got Black Letter Soldier Envoy at the beginning. This is a very, very powerful card, just like CED was, but this card is a bit more manageable. It doesn't necessarily win the game on the spot, although there are definitely situations where it can, but I do think it is a bit of a better boss monster to have in the format. Very, very powerful, but not overwhelmingly so. Next up, we've got DMOC here for the other banned, or not banned, but limited boss monsters. And DMOC is very powerful as well. You know, if you special summon this card, you get a spell back. Even if you normal summon this card, you get a spell back. And there are ways that you can sort of abuse this. But I do think DMOC does take a bit of setup to actually pull off. And so they're probably fine having it limited here because there aren't too many ways to super abuse this card outside of certain combo decks that do need a fair bit to go right for them to actually pull off the combos. Next up, we got Jinzo. Jinzo is very powerful at shutting off trap cards, so it shuts off an entire subset of cards in the game. So it makes sense why it is limited here. Realistically, though, you know, I don't really think it would make too much more of an impact if it was unlimited, but it probably is good just to have it limited to 1, so that way, you know, especially in siding, you can't just side in 3 Jinzos against a given back row deck. So I do think that does make sense. Lastly, for the limited boss monsters, we've got Sacred Phoenix of Nephthys, which is a card that I'll talk about when I discuss the cards from Flaming Eternity. This is a very powerful recurable boss monster. If it's destroyed by a card effect, you get to bring it back, and there are multiple ways to sort of bring it out from the deck. I don't really think that limiting the card really matters that much, because realistically, you might only just be playing 1, because you can bring it out very easily off of Hand of Nephthys, which I'll also talk about. But, you know, it can't hurt to limit this card, so I don't really think it's the worst thing in the world here. Moving on from the boss monsters, we've got some cards that contribute to a strategy known as Empty Jar, namely Cyber Jar and Morphing Jar. Now, these are 2 very powerful flip effect monsters. Cyber Jar pops the entire field, and then, it basically reveals the top 5 cards of both players' decks, and then they bring out the monster that they can summon, either in face-up attack or face-down defense, and, you know, then the remaining cards are added to the hand. Morphing Jar discards both hands, and then each player draws 5 cards. And you can sort of combo these cards in addition with things like Book of Moon, Book of Taiyu, Shallow Grave, etc. And you can pull off a strategy known as Empty Jar, where you're just trying to mill out your opponent's deck. And in a similar vein, Protector of the Sanctuary is also limited here, because this card can be used in those sorts of strategies. If you activate card destruction, you can then use something like Call the Haunted to bring back Protector of the Sanctuary, and then your opponent will discard their hand, but then not draw anything. Realistically, that combo is very hard to pull off, and, you know, having this limited to 1 doesn't really change the consistency of it that much. I mean, it does technically, but, like, realistically, this combo is so bad that no one really is going to be playing it. So I don't really think this needed to be limited to 1. I don't think it really matters either way, but I guess better safe than sorry. Moving on from these more specific cards, we've got a bunch of just generically good monsters here. Breaker the Magical Warrior is a big beater at 1900, and then it can also pop a card going down to 1600 attack, which is very, very nice. We got Tri-Infecting Virus here, which can be a big board clear, wiping out your opponent's entire field of monsters as long as you've got cards to discard, and there are certain things that you can discard that makes that cost a lot more worth it. We've also got Reflect Bounder for the last of the bigger beaters here, and I don't really think this card necessarily belongs on the limited list. I guess it is powerful and burn because it does inflict damage to your opponent if they attack into it. But I think realistically, this card is not really good, probably could be off the list. Moving on to the more versatile cards, we've got Sangan. Sangan is very, very powerful. So powerful, in fact, that it was actually banned on the previous limited list. And now it's back. Now it's searching out monsters with 1500 less attack. And that is a variety of good monsters. In fact, all of the remaining monsters that are limited here can be searched out by Sangan. We've got DD Warrior Lady, which was unlimited in Warrior format. Very glad to see this limited, as DD Warrior Lady is very, very powerful, especially at 3 copies. But having it limited to 1 makes it a bit more restrictive there. Sinister Serpent is just a recurable resource. You know, I mentioned there are some cards that make the cost on Tribe worth it, and Sinister Serpent is definitely one of those because it just comes back from grave in your standby phase. So you just keep getting that resource back. You can use it to pay for things like Reigeki Break, etc. And it's very, very powerful for that reason. We've also got Exiled Force here, which can serve as a pop on a monster. It's also a warrior, which makes it searchable off of reinforcing the army, which I'll cover in the semi-limited list here. We've also got Injection Fairy Lily, which can deal a ton of damage out of nowhere. Pay 2,000, this card gains 3,000 attack, so that's 3,400 attack on a monster. If you need to get over something, this card can do it, and also deal a lot of damage to your opponent in the process. Lastly, for the limited monster, we got Twin-Headed Behemoth. This card, realistically, is not really that good. It's only on the limited list because of a technicality, because the way it was originally written caused confusion, because if you had multiple copies of Twin-Headed Behemoth and they used their effect, and then they got shuffled back in the deck, how do you know which one used its effect? How do you know which one didn't? So it's kind of an awkward card. So that's why it's just limited here. Realistically, if this card was unlimited, I don't really think it would change anything in terms of the meta. I think it would just make for some very annoying judge calls. So I do support it being on the list here. Moving on to limited spells, we got Pot of Greed, just draw 2, one of the most powerful cards in the game's history. And for some reason, they're still not banning this card. We've got Graceful Charity here, which was banned in Warrior format, now back. This card is very, very powerful at digging deeper into your deck, discarding cards. And as I mentioned with Tribe, there are some cards that you don't really care to discard off of things like this. So very, very powerful card at seeing more of your deck and seeing exactly what you need to deal with what your opponent's doing. We also got Delinquent Duo here. As I mentioned, they banned 2 of the hand rips, brought back this one. You know, they could have left this banned, but realistically, there are some things that do counter this. For instance, if your opponent has a Serpent in hand, then Duo is obviously a lot worse because you activate Duo, they pitch Serpent, and then it's like, well, they get that card back. So I realistically paid 1,000 life points for a random 1-for-1. But if they don't have Serpent, then this card can be really, really good. And it can just lock your opponent out of the game, especially if you recur it with something like Magician of Faith. So that makes this card very, very powerful and very, very degenerate and feels bad if you actually get it used on you. So a lot of people don't like this card in the format. But, you know, it is here now, and it is here to stay. Next up, we got Card Destruction in terms of cards to just discard cards. This is definitely one of them. And I think it's good that this card's at 1 because, again, Empty Jar can use this card really well to mill out their opponent's deck. So having this in 1 copy makes that a little bit less consistent. But also, you know, Chaos Turbo and things like that, there are decks that do play this card to dig deeper into their own deck, pitching cards like Sinister Serpent or maybe Thunder Dragons to basically have free value off this card. So I do think this card probably belongs on the limited list. If it was unlimited, then, you know, there might be some very degenerate turbo decks going around. So it probably does belong here. Next up for spell and trap removal, we've got Heavy Storm and Mystical Space Typhoon, 2 very powerful generic spell and trap removal cards. And so it makes sense why they're limited here. We've also got some equipped spells that will die to these cards. So, you know, these spells are probably happy that these cards are limited. But we got Snatch Steal to start off with. This is another sort of card that takes control of one of your opponent's monsters, but this does give them 1,000 every turn. Also, they can clear it with something like Mystical Space Typhoon or Heavy Storm. So it does have that advantage for them. Also, Premature Burial gets you a card back from the graveyard. And also, you know, if it's returned to hand with something like Trinade or Abyss Soldier, then you get to reuse it. So that makes it very powerful there. But because there are ways to stop it, again, Mystical Space Typhoon, Heavy Storm, it is a bit more okay being legal than Reborn. Next up, we got Mage Power and United We Stand. These are mainly used for weird OTK combos because they do buff up monsters a lot. Mage Power increases the attack of the monster by 500 for every spell and trap you have control, and United We Stand increases the attack by 800 for every face-up monster you control. And this can mean a lot of damage, especially equipped to something like a Benkei or a Hayabusa Knight or a Mataza the Zapper or any variety of cards that are able to take advantage of this attack boost. So very, very powerful there. And lastly, for the limited spells, we've got Lightning Vortex, which is a new card that I'll talk about later, which clears all of your opponent's face-up monsters. So that's very, very strong. Of course, it only clears face-up monsters. It also does require a discard. So it's not quite as free as something like Raigeki, for instance, but it is still very powerful and it deserves to be limited here. And also Sword of Feeling Light, I think this card could maybe come off the list. Yes, it would be a bit more degenerate for like stallier decks to have access to this, but you could just, deal with that in the side deck, like playing multiple Dust Tornadoes, things like that. So I don't really think this card is that good, but I get why it's on here to curb the power of stall decks, but I don't know. This card probably could be semi-limited or even legal. Moving on to the traps, though, we've got Call of the Haunted here to bring back your monsters, which is very, very powerful. And, just like with Premature Burial, it can be dealt with by MST or Call of the Haunt or Heavy Storm. But, it is still very good if you can pull it off. Next up, we've got a Torrential Tribute here to clear away your opponent's monsters. Very powerful board clear, especially in a format where there aren't as many board clears as in the DM era. Next up, we've got Mirror Force. Mirror Force is another board clear, but it's one that your opponent can sort of play around. This card was banned in Warrior format. I am very happy that it's limited here because I do think it does reward skillful play, right? You do have to play around this. If you get blown out by Mirror Force, then you probably could have played a bit differently to avoid that fate. So I think this is more of a skillful card than a less skillful card. And I think having more things to play around in the format does make it a bit better. So I do think that this being limited is very good. Next, we got Ring of Destruction, very powerful destruction card as well. It also, deals burn damage to your opponent and you based on the attack of the monster. This card can end games in this format, and so it's very, very good for that reason. We've also got, in the topic of burn cards, we got Ceasefire here. This flips up all face-down defense position monsters and deals damage to your opponent 500 times the number of effect monsters on the field. So this is very good against flip focus decks because it shuts off flip effects, and also it's very good at just dealing some burn damage. So I think it's limited here because of the burn part, because if burn decks had access to this, they'd be a lot more powerful. So I think it's limited for that reason. I think this card is very good just in the side deck for a lot of decks as well, if you're up against a more flip-focused strategy. We've also got, on the topic of burn, Magic Cylinder. This card negates an attack and deals damage to your opponent equal to the attack of the attacking monster. Realistically, this card is not really that good, could probably be not on the limited list, but, they're here because of burn. And, I think they're probably trying to err on the side of caution with burn, not give them as many tools, because when burn is the best deck, a lot of people don't like that. So I do think it makes sense why this card is limited here, even though it probably doesn't need to be. Next up, we've got Reckless Greed. Reckless Greed just draws you 2 cards deeper into your deck and skips the next 2 draw phases. I think this is here largely for decks that might, turbo through things and do a big combo to, FTK or something like that. So I don't necessarily hate this being on the limited list. And lastly, for the limited traps, we've got Deck Devastation Virus, a new card from Flaming Eternity that I will talk about. But this says tribute 1 dark monster for 2,000 more attack. Look at your opponent's hand, all monsters they control, and all cards they draw until the end of their 3rd turn after this card's activation, and destroy all those monsters with 1,500 or less attack. This can be very powerful at stopping things, like Sangan or the flip monsters here from being able to even use their effects, just preemptively doing that. But it does take a 2,000 or more attack point dark monster to actually pull off here, which is a bit harder to pull off in this format than in some others. I mean, you can use like Chaos Orc or something like that, but is that an equitable trade? I'm not quite sure. It does give you hand knowledge though, which is very powerful. If you pair it with things like Mind Crush and things like that, it could be even more powerful. So I don't necessarily think this card is terrible. I think it's fine being on the list here. Again, better to err on the side of caution rather to enable a degenerate strategy by unlimiting this. But, I do think it is one of the more specific cards on this list. Lastly, for the semi-limited list, there's a lot of cards on the semi-limited list here. So, I know that people don't really like the semi-limited list, and, I think realistically a lot of these cards, it doesn't really matter that they're semi-limited, but it is important to go through. So firstly, we've got Abyss Soldier here. This card can be very good. You discard 1 water monster to the graveyard and target 1 card on the field, return to the hand. So, this can pair with Sinister Serpent as well, and most decks will be using Sinister Serpent with it if they are playing it, because, the typical water deck isn't necessarily the best in the format. So, this card can be very good in more controlling decks, and that's why it is semi-limited here. Also, Night Assailant is semi-limited. This makes a lot more sense rather than a lot of the other cards on the semi-limited list here, because basically the idea is if you discard this card, you get to add a flip monster in the graveyard back to your hand. So if you have multiple of these, then you can discard 1, get back the other, and then just sort of form a loop where you basically get free discards. So in order to curb the consistency of that, this card's limited down to 2 instead of having 3 copies at your disposal. We've also got a Marauding Captain here. This card also makes sense being semi-limited, although I think that the titular Marauding Captain lock is kind of overrated, and I don't really think it's that good. But basically, the idea is that, your opponent can't attack other warrior monsters you control besides Brawn and Captain. So if you have two of these out on the field, then they can't attack your warrior monsters at all. So the idea is by semi-limiting this, you decrease the consistency of that combo while still making the lock legal if you do want to go for it. I don't really think it's that good, but it is something that you can do if you want to. Next up, we got Vampire Lord. This is actually a new semi-limit. This card used to be limited, but the card is really not that good, so it makes sense why this card's semi-limited now. Of course, zombie decks can bring it out off Pyramid Turtle and stuff, so realistically, if it's limited versus semi-limited, probably doesn't matter that much. You're probably just playing one copy of it, maybe two in the side, in case like you're up against a deck that really does fold to this card, but realistically, this card's not really going to come up that much. Basically, if it's destroyed by a card effect, you get to bring it back during standby phase, just like with Nephthys, but it only has 2,000 attack, and it's just not really that good. Again, as I mentioned, you can interpret this out, but like realistically, a 2,000 attack point beater is not going to compare to a lot of other things that your decks are going to be packing in this format. So this card, probably a bit overrated in history, but I'm very glad that it's semi-limited as opposed to limited now. Next up, we get Manticore of Darkness. This is another semi-limit that actually makes a bit of sense because this is another sort of combo, kind of like Knight Assailant. Basically, during the end phase of this card is in the graveyard because it was sent there this turn. You could send one Beast, Wing Beast, or Beast Warrior monster from your hand or face up field of the graveyard, spell summon this card from your graveyard. So the idea is that if you've got like card of safe return on the field and you bring out a Manticore of Darkness by sending another Manticore of Darkness you control to the graveyard, then you basically get to recur it because then the other Manticore of Darkness you send to the graveyard gets to send the first Manticore of Darkness to the graveyard, get to bring that back, and then you just keep that loop going. You draw through your entire deck, potentially drawing into something like Exodia. So that's the idea behind semi-limiting this card. Realistically, this combo is a lot harder to pull off, especially when they banned things like Painful Choice. But it probably is still better that this card's semi-limited than that it's not. Next up, we've got Chick the Yellow. This card is a bit of an interesting case. This card is really here because of a combo that you can do with Mikura and Call the Haunted along with Chick the Yellow. But realistically, that combo probably wasn't even the best when it was legal. And now that Mikura is banned, there's no real reason to semi-limit this card. So, this card doesn't really make a difference here. But it is good to know that it's semi-limited in case for some reason you do want to play 3 copies of it, maybe in a Mene the Thorn sort of build of warriors. But realistically, this card will never come up. Moving on to the spells, we've got Nobleman of Crossout. This is probably the most powerful semi-limited spell on the list, maybe even the most powerful semi-limited card on the list. This card just lets you banish a face-down defensive position monster and then banish additional copies of that monster from the deck if it was a flip monster. So that makes it very powerful against more defensive strategies, but even if you're just playing a regular game, your opponent likely will set monsters at some point. And so just having this card to banish those is very good. Next, we've got Reinforcing the Army at 2 copies. This would really increase the consistency of warrior decks if it was at 3 copies, so I like this being at 2. Basically, it just searches one level 4 lower warrior monster from your deck and adds it to your hand. So very powerful, especially if you can sort of toolbox into the exact warrior that you need. So I do think this card probably belongs on the semi-limit list here. Next up, we got Creature Swap. This card basically swaps control of a monster you control and one monster that your opponent controls. There are a lot of things you can pair with it. You can pair Sin's Serpent or Scapegoat token, or just a recruiter like Mystic Tomato and take control of one of your opponent's powerful monsters. It does have some flaws. If your opponent has multiple monsters on field, then it can be a bit awkward. But it is still a powerful card, and so it probably does deserve to be semi-limited in some respect. Next up, we've got a new semi-limited here. This card used to be limited, now semi-limited, and that is Upstart Goblin. This is a pretty simple spell. It says draw 1 card, then your opponent gains 1,000 life points. So for certain turbo decks, they want to draw deeper into their deck. This card allows them to do so. So realistically, maybe this card should have stayed limited, but it's in sort of a nebulous position where life points still do matter in this format, whereas, card advantage also matters. So like it isn't pretty fair trade-off that some decks won't want to make, some decks will want to make, and realistically it's just replaces itself. So it's not the most card advantage that you're ever going to get. So I do think that this card is probably fine at 2 copies, even though it does sort of benefit certain turbo decks more than others. Next up, we've got Emergency Provisions. I think this card is only here because of Mirage Nightmare, and now that Mirage Nightmare is banned, this card probably doesn't even need to be on the list, but basically this card is a quick play spell. So send any number of other spell or traps to control the graveyard. Gain 1,000 life points for each card sent to the graveyard this way. So what you do with Mirage is you'd activate Mirage, draw your cards, then use Emergency Provisions to send the Mirage to grave before you had to discard for its effect. Now that Mirage is banned, realistically this card only serves as sort of like an anti-burn tech. So like I don't really think this card needs to be semi-limited, but it is here. I don't expect it to stay for long, though. Next up, we've got Level Limit Area B. This card probably deserves to be semi-limited. This is very powerful in stall decks. Basically, it says change all face-up level 4 or higher monsters to defense position. So if you're a stall deck, you can use this to basically stop your opponent from attacking. So that's very good, and probably deserves to be semi-limited here, especially when there's another card that also prevents level 4 or higher monsters from attacking. That is Gravity Bind, which is also newly semi-limited. So this says it's just a continuous trap, and it says level 4 or higher monsters cannot attack. So basically the same thing as level limit area B. But instead of changing the defense, it just stops them from attacking. So probably good that these two cards are semi-limited because it can really slow down the game quite a bit. Next up, we got Last Turn. This is a very degenerate alt win con. Basically, it's very convoluted, but the idea is if you get Jowgen the Spiritualist or some other monster that prevents your opponent from special summoning, and you activate this card, you basically win the game. So there's a lot of convoluted hoops to jump through to actually pull it off. But that is why it is semi-limited here, because, they didn't want to ban the deck entirely, but also they didn't necessarily want this deck to be more consistent than it already is. So, this is a very interesting card, but realistically, it is probably deserved on the semi-limited list here. And lastly, we've got a new card here, Good Goblin Housekeeping. This is a normal trap. This says draw cards equal to the number of Good Goblin Housekeeping cards in your graveyard +1. Then select one card from your hand and return to the bottom of your deck. This card is very powerful if Makura the Destructor is legal, because basically what you can do is you can use Makura and then basically use this as draw cards. And because you're doing this over the course of one turn, you basically draw into more of these. You get more draws off them, more stacking. So it's just very, very powerful. And so I think it was probably put on some limits for Makura. But realistically, I don't think this card is too good. I mean, there is a combo you can do also with Emerging Provisions, where you activate this card, use Emerging Provisions to send it to grave, and then it will count itself in grave as one of the cards that it's looking for. So then you get to draw more. But realistically, the combo is not the best. I mean, it is something you can do, and I have seen certain decks doing that. But I don't necessarily think this card being at 3 versus 2 is going to make that much of a difference there. But that's going to do it for the new Forbidden list here. I think this list is pretty good, even though it does have some potential flaws. But then again, the Warrior Limit list also had some potential flaws, so I don't necessarily think that one is better than the other. But it is still cool to see how they're continuing to adapt the list to their new philosophy on banning problem cards and limiting and semi-limiting certain cards that they don't necessarily want to see prevalent play. But now that we've discussed the list, let's actually dive into the new cards that GOAT format introduces. Before diving into this part of the video, I want to give a big shout out to the Discord user Hoy for actually putting together these card lists here. I used to go through the packs and make the card lists in DB by myself, and that would always take a fair bit of time, but Hoy volunteered to do it this time and they put it together. So big thank you to them for making this part of the video possible. Now, to start off with the new cards, I'm going to dive into Flaming Eternity, which was officially the last booster set of the DM era. So I guess you could sort of count a hypothetical Flaming Eternity format as the last DM format. And I will be doing a video on that next week, so look forward to that. But realistically, I don't really think that format is different enough from GOAT or Warrior to sort of merit its own long-term coverage. If it is different, it would just be in the form of one degenerate deck, which I will be covering in the video next week, basically making use of Good Goblin Housekeeping and Makura the Destructor to do degenerate things. But realistically, I don't think things will change that much. Now, that being said, this set is still relatively powerful given the sets that will come later. There are some staples that were introduced that did see a variety of play in certain decks, but those staples were oftentimes more specific than staples have been in the past. And to explain that, let's just start off with the first of the staples, Grand Monarch, the Rock Monarch. Now, the Monarchs have been releasing steadily since Ancient Sanctuary, and they all do different things. Grand Monarch is a 2400 attack point, 1000 defense point rock monster. Says if this card is tribute summon, target one set card on the field, destroy that target. So this can be a set monster or a set spell trap, which sort of combines the utility of Zaborg and Mobius together, because Zaborg pops monsters, Mobius pops spells and traps. So you might want to play this over those if you're basically playing it to pop set monsters or, back row. But, a lot of people chose not to play this in favor of things like Mobius or Zaborg instead, because those cards just have less restrictions. If you want a Zaborg, an opponent's face-up monster, then that's very good. If you want a Mobius more than one back row, then that's very good as well. So a lot of people didn't really play this card as much, although it did see some play and also some play in side decks as well. And so it is still a very powerful card that I figured I'd mention here. If we're talking about popping spell and traps in the back row, we've also got Chiron the Mage, which also saw some play because it does just get rid of spells and traps, which can be very powerful against certain style of your decks. It says once per turn, you can discard one spell, then target one spell or trap your opponent controls, destroy that target. Now, of course, spells are often very high impact cards, so you don't necessarily want to be discarding them, but against decks where you actively need to get rid of their back row, then this card can be very good. And it did see some side deck play along with some main deck play at different times, so it is good to know about and potentially have your mind on if you're thinking about ways to pop back row. Golem Sentry is a card that has sort of seen more play more recently, where it's a rock effect monster, 800 attack, 1800 defense, sort of falls into the Pac-Man sort of style of play. And it says 1 per turn, you can chain this card to face down defense position. When this card flips, summon target 1 monster your opponent controls, return that target to hand. So 1800 defense can be a bit tough to get over. You can also use this to bounce your opponent's monsters back, which is very powerful. And so this card does see a little bit more play now. Although it's still not like, a generic staple. Not every deck is playing this, but some decks are. And of course, there are sort of other cards that go along with this strategy that we'll get to when we cover the Lost Millennium. Don't worry, we'll get to those. But, this card is a generic staple if you do want to play it. Moving on to the spells, probably the most important of the generic spell staples is Lightning Vortex. I mentioned this on the Forbidden Limitless discussion, but this card lets you discard a card, destroy all face-up monsters your opponent controls. They can be a very powerful board wipe and can enable you to get in to, deal some damage. So I do think this card is very good and should probably see play at least in the side deck. There are certain, Reason Gate Turbo decks that set up a big board of aggressive monsters, and this card can wipe that away and wipe away all their progress. So I think this card is very good to know about. Next up, we've got a Feather of the Phoenix. This is a normal spell that says discard 1 card, then target 1 card in your graveyard, and return that target to the top of your deck. This can be very powerful for certain combo decks. Things like Library FTK or Empty Jar really like this card because basically it lets them stack their deck more. It pairs with something like Archfiend Oath in the case of Library FTK. It can allow them to get back a powerful flip monster in the case of Empty Jar, or just a powerful card that they want to draw off a flip monster like Morphing Jar or Cyber Jar. So this card is very good in those decks. And even beyond those decks, just being able to add back a card to the top of your deck that you really do want to draw on the next turn can be pretty decent, although it does draw lock you potentially. It lets your opponent know what you're going to do on the next turn. So it's not the best, but it is a good card to know about. Next up, we've got Phoenix Wing Wind Blast. This is probably the best of the staple traps this set introduced. This is a normal trap that says discard 1 card, then target 1 card your opponent controls, place that target on top of the deck. And it's a very powerful effect. It draw locks your opponent for a turn, and it also just gets rid of one of their annoying cards. So that's very nice. I know that certain Turbo decks do play this, certain Turbo decks play Raigeki Break, but this card is very good to know about in general. And if you're looking for sort of good removal and you can afford the discards, then this card is potentially for you. Next up, we got Threatening Roar. Threatening Roar is a simple normal trap that says your opponent cannot declare an attack this turn, which can be very powerful against certain OTK decks. You basically have this card in the side deck, bring it in, and then if they do their big combo, you activate this to prevent them from attacking in, which is very good. Next up, we got Goodly on Housekeeping. I mentioned this earlier. This is kind of a weird staple to include. It is a draw card, so I figured it might as well be a staple here. But realistically, not many decks are going to play this. But, if you can stack the good Goblin Housekeepings, then it can be pretty good there. But that's a bit tough to do. So I don't really think this is the best, but it is, staple enough for me to mention here. And next up, we've got Deck Devastation Virus. Again, like good Goblin Housekeeping, this won't be for every deck, but for decks that can play, it can be pretty strong. I mentioned it on the limited list here. But, it is a very powerful effect. So if you're playing things like Zimbar of the Dark, or you're going into a big dark monster, like maybe your zombie deck, for instance, and you want to play this card, I think it can be pretty good. Next up, we've got the cover card for the set, Sacred Phoenix of Nephthys. This is a very powerful boss monster I mentioned on the limited list here. Basically, it recurred itself is destroyed by a card effect, so it can be very powerful, and 2400 attack is nothing to scoff at. This thing can get over things like Chaos Sorcerer, although Chaos Sorcerer can also deal with this by banishing it. But, I think it is a pretty neat boss monster and pretty cool to see. And one of the nice things about this card is that even though it is a level 8 monster, which is normally typically hard to get out, we've got Hand of Nephthys here to actually bring it out much more easily. You get to tribute this card and one other monster, special summon 1 Sacred Phoenix of Nephthys from your hand or deck. So that makes it a lot simpler to get out. And also, this is a level 2 spellcaster, which means that you can bring this out off of Apprentice Magician. So there are ways to search out this card, which can search out Nephthys, which is very nice. Now, if we're talking about ways to take advantage of Nephthys further, I don't really think you need them because Nephthys is kind of its own thing. But if you do want to lean more into the gimmick, we've got Firebird here. And Firebird is a winged beast that says each time a winged beast type monster on your side of the field is destroyed, this card gains 500 attack. And so if you can destroy your own Nephthys, then you can gain this card attack and make it its own sort of powerhouse. Especially because Nephthys will recur itself, so then you don't really lose as much value there. So, you can do that, and, there are some cards that can destroy Nephthys. They're not really that good. I mean, Assault on GHQ is one that came out in Flaming Eternity. If you really do want to go for this strategy, it says target 1 monster you control, destroy it, then send 2 cards from the top of your opponent's deck to the graveyard. It's not really a good effect. you know, it's not really the best to destroy this either, because it's like destroying your powerful card here. But I guess you can do this if like you're trying to dodge around things like, you know, your opponent's Chaos Zork or something like that. You can use this card, get rid of the Nephthys, maybe buff up a Firebird if you got one on field. So you can do that sort of thing, but I don't really think it's worth going all in on that sort of effect or strategy, but it is something interesting that you could potentially do here. Now, if we're talking about other interesting things you could potentially do, let's start diving into the more specific strategies for this format. And, you know, especially given that we were talking about the Winged Beast type, let's just take out the winged part and talk about the beast type in general, because beasts did get a couple of new tools here. The one thing they got was a new boss monster, Behemoth, the king of all animals. Today, a level 7 beast monster, 2700 attack, 1500 defense, but you can normal summon or set this card with 1 tribute. But if you do that, then its original attack becomes 2000. So not quite as good as the 2700 beast deck here. But when this card is tribute summoned, you can target beast monsters in your graveyard equal to the number of monsters tributed and return them to your hand. So you get some of the value back that you put into this card. And I believe if you play things like Skill Drain and stuff, it might go back to 2700. I could be wrong about that. But so there are some things you can do with that. And it's kind of an interesting effect there, and an interesting boss monster for sure. And if we're talking about other beast boss monsters, we've also got the level 5 Big Tusk Mammoth. This is a 2000 attack point monster. So kind of like, you know, Behemoth in its base form. But this said monsters your opponent controls cannot attack the turn they are summoned. So this is like a Vengeful Bog Spirit on legs. It can sort of slow down your opponent's pace of play and allow you to make bigger beasts and things like that. So I don't necessarily think this card is terrible. I don't really think it's the best either, but, you know, I don't really think Behemoth's the best either. So I don't think that necessarily these are going to be the top boss monsters of the form, but they are interesting to see beast monsters get these support. Now, if we're talking about beast support, probably the most powerful beast support in this format and in general is Rescue Cat. Rescue Cat's a level 4 monster that says you can send this card to the graveyard, special summon 2 level 3 or lower beast monsters from your deck. Now, the last part of this effect that you see on Dueling Book, where it says the effects are negated, also they're destroyed during the end phase, blah, blah, blah. The effect negation thing is not a case in Rescue Cat in this format, because, you know, Rescue Cat eventually got eroded because it was too powerful. Now, they are still destroyed in the end phase. That is still true. But you also can use multiple Rescue Cat effects in one turn. So, for instance, if you use Rescue Cat, then bring it back off something like Premature Burial, then use it again, you can bring out even more cards. So, this card can get out of hand really quick if you can actually take advantage of it. And especially if you go into things like Gyakugiri Pandas or maybe Mindless Radiance to boost up the Gyakugiri Pandas, this can make this card a really big threat here. Very, very cool to see Beast get this sort of support. It's not quite as broken as it is in later formats, but it is still very cool to see. Now we move into the bad beasts, starting with Blade Rabbit. Blade Rabbit is a level 2 beast. 400 attack, 300 defense. Says when this card changed from attack position to face up defense position, destroy 1 monster on your opponent's side of the field. So this sort of goes with the clown control sort of style of play. But realistically, I don't really think beasts can support that much. I mean, I guess if you're playing Gyakugiri Pandas and stuff, then you might be playing a bit more of a Stallier deck. If you're playing a Stallier deck, maybe you can sort of set up this combo a bit. But like realistically, if you're playing Gyakugiri Pandas, you're going to be using those to get over your opponent's stuff. So I don't really know. It doesn't really fit the strategy in my opinion, but it is kind of interesting there. Next up, we got Hyena. Hyena is a level 3 beast that can sort of swarm the field, just like Rescue Cat does, which says when this card is destroyed by battle, sent to the graveyard, you can special summon any number of hyenas from your deck. So the idea is that you destroy it, you get 2 more potentially, and that can be pretty decent, especially if you're using them to buff up Majigire Panda. Majigire Panda is a beast that says each time a beast-type monster on the field is destroyed, this card gains 500 attack. So you can use hyenas to buff this thing up to 2500 potentially. You can also even use your opponent's Geometry tokens to buff this thing up, because those are beasts. So it doesn't say that those cards have to go to the graveyard or they have to be on your side of the field, but you can use this thing in conjunction with them and potentially Gyakugiri Panda to deal burn damage to that, buff up your Majigire Panda even more. Now, realistically, this card is not as good as Gyakugiri Panda because the power of Gyakugiri Panda is that it can pierce through your opponent's Ojama tokens. So, like, realistically, having this card just gaining passive attack and not dealing piercing damage is not really the best, but it is something you can potentially use if you want to. Next up, we've got Kangaroo Champ. This is a beast-type monster, 800 attack, 700 defense. It says a monster that battles with this card changes defense position after damage calculation. So, again, this kind of compares with Gyakugiri Panda, but it's real bad. There's so many better beasts that you can use with Gyakugiri Panda. So I don't really think this card is that good. It's kind of interesting, though. I guess it does sort of put your opponent in a vulnerable position, potentially, if their monster doesn't have high defense. But it just is relatively bad. Next up, we got Catnipped Kitty, which is arguably even worse. This says this card cannot be attacked if there's another beast-type monster on your side of the field. Once per turn, you can make the defense of 1 monster on your opponent's side of the field 0 until the end of the turn. So just like with Kangaroo Champ, this card also pairs with Gyakugiri Panda. lowering the defense down to 0, so that way Gekigiri can deal even more damage to it. But realistically, this card takes a lot more setup than Kangaroo Champ does, and you're not really going to get that setup. Also, if you're using things like Geometrio with Gekigiri Panda, then you're probably just better off using that because that's the better combo. You know, it takes less pieces to put together. It's more versatile, so realistically, this card is not very good. Lastly, for the monsters here, we got Chusuke the Mousefire. Now, I don't typically talk about just standard normal monsters that are in a set unless they have some special stat or some other thing associated with them. And Chusuke, I'm only talking about here because next set, Lost Millennium, actually does have some cards specifically related to Chusuke. But unfortunately, this fiery mouse traveling the world to become the strongest fighter in the world of mice is not really that notable in this set, besides just being a beast along with the other beast support. So in terms of non-monster beast support, we've also got the Big March of the Animals, which is a very good, powerful spell that can buff up your cards if you're making a big offensive push. This says all face-up beast monsters you control gain 200 attack for each beast monster you control until the end of this turn. So if you've got a bunch of beast monsters on your field, especially after bringing them out off of something like Rescue Cat, then this thing can be used to pump a lot of damage into them. So this card is pretty good, and also it's a who's who of beast monsters. So I love looking through the art and trying to, pick out which beast monsters are which. Next up, we've got Poison Fangs, not Beast Fangs. Beast Fangs was an equipped spell from LOB, I'm pretty sure. Poison Fangs is a continuous spell that says each time a beast-type monster inflicts battle damage to your opponent, inflict 500 damage to your opponent. So this is another way to sort of pump on more damage. But realistically, if you're trying to inflict battle damage to your opponent, the Big March of Animals is probably a little bit better because this will deal on average like 800 or more damage, because if you've got two beast monsters on your side of the field, then each of them will gain 400. And if they're each both attacking in, then they'll deal 800 total. I mean, I guess Poison Fangs does deal 1,000 if you got two that are attacking in that way. But if you got 3 or more beasts, then the Big March of the Animals does win out in that case, because then they'll deal 600 each. So I think Big March of Animals is still a bit better. So, Poison Fangs is interesting, but also it can be stopped by like MST or Dust Tornado, etc. So realistically, I don't really think it's that good. Next up, for the only beast support trap here, we've got Beast Soul Swap. This is a normal trap that says target one beast type monster you control, return to the hand, and if you do, special summon one beast type monster from your hand with the same level as the monster that was returned to the hand. Now, there are some very interesting things you can do with this. For instance, if you've got two Behemoth, the king of all animals, you can tribute summon out one, just sending a beast monster you control to the graveyard. It's 2,000 attack. You then use the Beast Soul Swap to bring out another Behemoth from your hand, which will have the full 2,700 attack. Now, it's a bit lossy because you're using a lot of resources to do that, but Behemoth brings back the resource that you tribute for it, so realistically, you're only using like kind of like 2 resources to do the Beast Soul Swap. But it is a very interesting combo that you can do. There are also other things that you can do. For instance, if you bring out a Beast off Rescue Cat, then you can use Beast Soul Swap to add one back to your hand, and then bring out another that will then not be destroyed by Rescue Cat's effect. So there are some cool things that you can do with this card. I think it's very versatile. I'm not really sure it's powerful enough to really see play in a lot of these decks, but it is kind of interesting to know about. Moving on from types and moving to attributes, we have Element Doom and Element Valkyrie. Now, these are two monsters that sort of complete the Element series of cards that was introduced in the previous sets that, led up to Warrior format. And basically, the gimmick behind these cards is that they gain additional effects given the attributes on field. Fire gains the monster 500 attack. Water means that the control of the card cannot switch. And Earth means that they negate the effect of an effect monster this card destroyed by battle. And Wind means that if this card destroyed an opponent's monster by battle, it can attack once again in a row. So those effects sort of carry through all the element monsters. And these are just sort of the last two combinations, I think, of 2 that you can make. So just sort of closing out those combinations there. Realistically, I don't really think this deck is that good, and I don't really think these cards are that unique either. I don't think that one specific combination of these two is going to come up more than another, but it is interesting to see this series sort of end. Speaking of series ending, we've also got Flame Ruler and Whirlwind Prodigy. Flame Ruler is a fire monster that can be treated as 2 tributes for the tribute summon of a fire monster, and Whirlwind Prodigy is a wind monster that can be treated as 2 tributes for the tribute summon of a wind monster. And this completes the sort of like W tribute sort of series of monsters, like with Double Costin, Kaiser Seahorse, Trojan Horse, and Unshaven Angler. So this completes that set of them. Now all the elements have their own double tributor. Whether these cards are that good, I would say no. But it is kind of interesting to see that series also get completed. And speaking of attributes, we've also got Elemental Burst here. This is a normal trap that says tribute 1 each of wind, water, fire, and earth monsters to activate this card. Destroy all cards on your opponent's side of the field. Now, that may seem like a very powerful effect, but actually pulling it off takes a lot of effort. It also is a 5 for however many cards are on your opponent's side of the field trade, which, like, card economy-wise, is not really that good. in my opinion, because your opponent has to have like 6 cards, I'd say, to really make this worth it. And if your opponent has 6 cards on field already, they're probably in a very good spot. So I don't really like this thing. And also, Farin Kazan is just much, much better. Farin Kazan is a normal trap from Rising Destiny. And basically, it says if you control or not even if you control, but if there is a wind, water, fire, and earth monster on the field, then you get to activate one of a set of effects, one of which is destroying all your opponent's monsters, one of which is destroying all their spells and traps, and the other of which is discarding 2 random cards from their hand. So basically, that card lets you pick whichever, one is more important, the spells or traps or the monsters to destroy. So it's slightly less good than Elemental Burst in that regard, but oftentimes your opponent will have more of one or more of the other, or you'll care more about one or more of the other. So you want Farin Kazan to wipe out that. Also, doesn't tribute off your monsters. And also, if you don't really care about your opponent's monsters or their spells and traps, you also get the additional potential effect of discarding from their hand. So that card is much, much better than this card by a long shot. But, this card is kind of interesting to see here. Now, the last set of cards in this set that have to do with attributes are the Earth Hexfield Fusion, the Light Hexfield Fusion, and the Dark Hexfield Fusion. And these are all monsters that basically turn you into like fusion substitutes. So it says you can substitute this card for any one fusion material monster, but the other fusion material monster must be correct. You can tribute fusion material monsters on the field, including this face-up card. Special summon 1 corresponding Earth fusion monster from your deck. And, the Light Hexfield Fusion and the Dark Hexfield Fusion have the same effect, but with their corresponding attributes. And all these cards have the same stats as well. So you can sort of treat these interchangeably for whatever deck you want to build to. Earth does have some good targets. It can bring out like Ryu Senshi, for instance, and Last Word from Another Planet. So that can be very good. Dark also has some good targets. I mean, a lot of good fusion monsters are dark, including some new ones in this set that I'll talk about in a second. Light, unfortunately, has basically no good targets right now. You can bring out like Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon, I guess. But realistically, there isn't much else that you'd be bringing out off Light. So this card is easily the worst of the bunch right now. Later, it gets a bit better because there are some Light fusion monsters that come out that are very good. But for here, this card is pretty bad. Now, I mentioned that there are some new fusion monsters in the set that Dark can bring out, and those namely are King Dragoon and Gatling Dragon. Now, Gatling Dragon is a level 8 fusion monster, which is very good for Metamorphosis, because Metamorphosis, prior to this, did not have a level 8 target they could really bring out. And this card needs Barrel Dragon, Blowback Dragon to make if you want to make it correctly. Because once per turn, you can toss a coin 3 times and destroy as many monsters on the field as possible, but not more than the number of heads. That's a very good effect. So a lot of decks that are trying to do things with Metamorphosis and potentially Dark Magician of Chaos or Cyberstein, they basically get a new tool in their disposal. So that's very nice to see. King Dragoon is also a very powerful tool in those decks' disposal. Level 7 Dragon Fusion effect is made with Lord D and Divine Dragon Ragnarok, and it says your opponent cannot target dragon monster with card effects, which includes this because it is a dragon. And once per turn, you can special summon 1 dragon monster from your hand. So there are a lot of decks that sort of want to benefit from that, especially if you're playing something like the Horus package. That can be very good as well there. And the Divine Dragon Ragnarok that it's made with is this Divine Dragon Ragnarok. It's level 4 normal monster, 1500 attack, 1000 defense. Not really the best card on its own, but you can pair it with the Dark Hexfield Fusion to make the King Dragoon. So that's kind of interesting there. It also is a light monster, so if you want to fuel chaos plays, then it can also fuel that. Now, speaking of fusion, there are also some other fusion support cards here, namely Centrifugal Field, which is a field spell that says when a fusion monster is destroyed by a card effect and sent to the graveyard, its owner targets 1 fusion material monster in their graveyard that's listed on the fusion monster. That player spell summons that target, which can be good if you're making the fusion monsters with things like the Hexfield Fusion, because they do need one of the correct fusion materials to actually make. So this card can get you some value there. Unfortunately, the cards you're getting back are probably not going to be the best. I mean, if you make something like a sandwich, then that can be pretty good because sandwich is made with Sangan. So, you can get back Sangan, so that's kind of neat. But realistically, a lot of the fusion materials on these cards are not going to be that good. So, there aren't really many things you can do with this card, but it is kind of interesting to see here as a fusion support, and maybe we'll get better in the future. The probably better fusion support card is Refusion. Now, this is an equip spell that says activate this card by paying 800 life points. Then target 1 fusion monster in your graveyard, special summon it, and equip it with this card. When this card is destroyed, banish the equipped monster. So this is basically like Premature Burial, but you can play it at more copies. So if you really do want to be reviving your fusion monsters, now those fusion monsters have to be properly summoned first. So, you can't necessarily bring back a monster that you bring out off Metamorphosis. But if you bring them out properly, then you can use Refusion to bring them back, which is kind of neat. Now, speaking of equip spells, we've got a bunch of equip support as well. Firstly, we've got Armed Samurai Benkei, which is a card that a lot of people know about because it can make sort of the centerpiece of its own strategy. This says, for each equip card equipped to this card, it gains 1 additional attack during each battle phase. So basically the idea is you buff this up with a bunch of equip cards, and then it gets you attack in for a ton of damage. So this card is very good. It basically replaces things like Hayabusa Knight. Doesn't necessarily replace Mataza though, because Mataza has some other benefits. But this card is still very good if you can pull it off, and it's definitely a build around card, but if you can build around it and get the combo off, then it can be very, very strong. Next, we got a combo that is a lot less good than Benkei with Gearfried the Swordmaster. Now, this is a monster that can only be summoned off Release Restraint, which says tribute 1 Gearfried the Iron Knight, special summon 1 Gearfried the Swordmaster from your hand or deck. And this says cannot be normal summoner set, must be special summon with Release Restraint. Each time an equipped monster or equipped card is equipped to this card, target 1 monster your opponent controls, destroy that target. So basically, this lets you just pop your opponent's field if you've got a bunch of equipped spells, which can be pretty good. However, if you're playing a bunch of equipped spells, you also need to be playing Gearfried the Iron Knight, which, you know, this card, Gearfried does not play well with equips in general. So it's kind of awkward in that regard. Sure, you can just equip things like Blast with Chain or Smoke Grenade of the Thief to this card, and that also benefits Gearfried, so you can sort of lean into that more. But realistically, I don't really think this card is good enough to see consistent competitive play. It is a cool deck to build around. If you can bring this out, it is really cool. But Release Restraint also being unsearchable does also put a wrinkle in this plan. Next up, for the last equip spell in this set, we've got Fulfillment of the Contract. That is an equip spell, just like Refusion, that says activate this card by paying 800 life points, then target 1 ritual monster in your graveyard, spell summon it, and equip it with this card. When this card is destroyed, banish the equipped monster. So it's just like Refusion, both rituals, and that's honestly a bit better because rituals are much easier to bring out. You basically have to bring them out off their proper summoning condition. So this card will generally be live when you're dealing with ritual monsters. And also there are some like Relinquish that you do want to bring back to then suck up more of your opponent's stuff. But again, you know, this is more if you need extra revival cards in addition to things like Premature Burial, Call the Haunted, etc. But it can be pretty good if you want to go for that. Now, banishing the ritual monster is kind of unfortunate because if you're playing multiple of these, then you'd want to necessarily use them multiple times on the same ritual monster, but them being banished is very awkward. So you do have to keep that in mind, but maybe as one of this card can be pretty decent. Now, I said that was the last equipped spell, but there is one more card that actually equips in this format, or this set, that is. And that is Brainjacker. Brainjacker is a level 2 Dark Fiend flip effect monster. It says equip this card to a monster on your opponent's side of the field and treat it as a equip card. Take control of the equipped monster. Your opponent gains 500 life points during each of their standby phases. Now, there are some caveats to that. If your opponent attacked into this card with a monster that actually can clear it in battle, then you won't actually get this effect because it will be destroyed, so it won't actually go through. So you need to actually protect this card before flipping it up. And then once you flip it up, it can take control of your opponent's stuff. But again, you know, if your opponent has MST, Dust Tornadoes, etc., there are many ways to deal with Brainjackers. Still, it's kind of an interesting utility card. And it sort of leads into a bunch of other interesting cards that didn't really fit in any of the previous categories, but I figured I'd mention here because they are interesting. You can play them if you want. They're just generally not that good. So next up, we got a Bear Uchiha Oni. This is a level 4 Beast Warrior. 1200 attack, 1200 defense. That says once per turn, you can toss a coin and call it. If you call it right, inflict 1000 damage to your opponent. If you call it wrong, you take 1000 damage. So that sort of goes with burn strategies I will be talking about very shortly. But it's kind of a bad burn card because it's not guaranteed damage. So I don't really think this card's worth playing in burn decks, but it is kind of interesting to see here. Next up, we got Blast Magician. Blast Magician is a level 4 spellcaster. 1400 attack, 1700 defense. Says each time a spell card is activated, place 1 spell counter on this card. When that spell card resolves, you can remove any number of spell card counters from this card. Then target 1 face-up monster on the field with attack less than or equal to the number of counters you remove times 700. Destroy that target. So, you know, if you just have this card sitting in defense position, a lot of cards can't necessarily beat over it that easily, and this card is going to be used as removal to clear your opponent's stuff. However, it does take a variety of spellcasters, spell counters that is, to get to a point where you'd have enough to destroy a powerful monster that your opponent has, and if your opponent has that powerful monster anyways, they can just attack over Blast Magician. So realistically, this isn't that good. But it is kind of interesting to see, and it sort of goes with a previous strategy of spell counters that is cool to see them trying to expand on further here. Next up, we got Shadow Slayer. Shadow Slayer is a level 4 Dark Fiend. 1400 attack, 200 defense. Says if all monsters your opponent controls are in defense position, this card can attack your opponent directly. This is basically like a worse Rocket Jumper, which is a level 3 monster that does the same thing. The reason why it's worse is that Rocket Jumper can pair with Level Limit Area B, which is very, very powerful. But this card can't pair with that because it would be switched to defense. It can pair, however, with Swords of Concealing Light, which is a continuous spell that says destroy this card during your second standby phase after activation. When this card resolves, change all monsters your opponent controls to face down defense position. Monsters your opponent controls cannot change their battle position. So what you can do is you can activate this card, summon out Shadow Slayer, and then attack in for damage. However, this card doesn't stop your opponent from bringing out more monsters to attack in over Shadow Slayer, so that makes it a bit worse. However, this card can be used in certain burn decks, especially if you're pairing it with Gyakugiri Panda. So, I think Burn could use this. However, it probably didn't necessarily need to because it's got 2 level limit area B, 2 gravity bind, so that should basically do this card's job for it. But it is kind of interesting to see here. And it's a card that could potentially see play in a variety of decks because it's kind of like multiple Book of Moons, although it's not reactive. So it's kind of interesting in that regard. Now, I have been mentioning Burn quite a bit, so let's talk about some of the more Burn-specific cards that are in this set. And firstly, we've got Mechadog Marin. Mechadog Marin is a light level 4 machine. 1000 attack, 1000 defense. Says when this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, inflict 1000 damage to both players. When this card on the field is destroyed and sent to the graveyard except by battle, inflict 1000 damage to your opponent. Now, unlike Albert Uchioni, this is a guaranteed burn if it's destroyed, which is pretty nice. However, you taking 1000 damage as well is kind of awkward. But if you can somehow manage to use this card to get aggressive with your burn, attacking into your opponent's stuff, then it can be potentially pretty good. You can also use it with things like Assaults on GHQ that I mentioned earlier. But again, I don't really think that's really worth it. But it is kind of interesting to see here. Next up, we get Meteor Destruction. This is a spell that says if your opponent's life points are higher than 3000, inflict 1000 damage to your opponent. In my opinion, this is kind of a worse Tremendous Fire because Tremendous Fire can be used at any time as long as you have more than 500 life points. So realistically, if you're in a position where you're less than 500 life points and you want to deal 1000 damage to your opponent, it's not going to be good if they have over 3000 life points left because you're not going to be killing them anytime soon in that case. So realistically, I don't really think this card is that good, but it is kind of interesting to see another sort of generic burn card here. Next up, we got DD Dynamite. This is a trap card that says inflict 300 damage to your opponent for each of their removed from play cards. Realistically, this won't come up that often because if your opponent is banishing cards from their graveyard, they're likely using things like Chaos Sorcerer or BLS, and those cards are good enough to sort of put a crimp in your game plan. But I do think that, there are some things you can do to sort of fuel this if you're playing Banisher of the Light, or if you're playing Cake of the Ghost Destroyer to banish cards from their grave. That can be very good. So, this card can see play in certain specific burn strategies, but realistically, I think most burn strategies are not really going to have a home for it. Next up, we got Spell Absorption. Speaking of specific burn strategies, this card can pair with Fire Princess Burn. Fire Princess is a monster that deals damage to your opponent every time you gain life points, and this is a continuous spell. This is each time a spell card is activated, gain 500 life points immediately after it resolves. So this card can gain you life, and then Fire Princess can burn your opponent. And this is probably part of why Alma got banned in this format, because, it can pair with Spell Absorption as well as with Royal Magical Library. So, that is probably the more realistic reason why it got banned, because it's a much easier setup to do Spell Absorption plus Gearfried plus Elma than Library plus Gearfried plus Elma. But either way, I don't really think that combo would have been the best, and I also don't think this card is the best. I think it's kind of neat. It gains you some life. If you've got the burn on lock, then it can be pretty good there, but it's a bit slow. It requires other cards to actually deal that burn, so I don't really think it's that good. Next up, we've got Cross Counter. Cross Counter is a normal trap that says if the defense position monster is higher than the attack of your opponent's attacking monster, the battle damage inflicted to your opponent is doubled. Destroy the attacking monster after damage calculation. This is kind of a roundabout way of dealing burn damage because you're already dealing damage from battle and it's just doubling that. And it does destroy the opponent's monster, so that's kind of nice. But realistically, the amount of burn damage that it's going to do is going to be very, very minuscule. Mainly, you'd be using this for the battle destruction effect. So, I mean, I don't even think it's that good for that either, but it is kind of interesting to see here. And so if you want to experiment it with it, you can. And speaking of just traps that are not really that good, but you can experiment with, I mean, give me some slack on that Sedway. The next couple of cards are really, really weird. First up, we've got Forced Ceasefire. Forced Ceasefire is a normal trap that says discard 1 card from your hand. No trap cards can be activated until the end of this turn. This is kind of a worse Royal Decree, and it does cost you a card in addition, and only lasts till the end of the turn. So this card is really bad. I don't really think it's that good. Even if you bring it in from the side against like burn focused decks or more trap focused decks, I don't think this card is worth a slot there because Decree is just better in every way. It doesn't cost you a card. Your opponent can chain traps to Decree when it's activated, sure, but they can also chain traps to Force Ceasefire when that's activated. So I don't really think this card is worth playing at all. Next up, we got Penalty Game. Very, very weird trap. It says when your opponent has 4 cards in their hand, this means exactly 4. So, yes, if they have 5 cards in their hand, they also have 4 cards in their hand. But this means when they have exactly 4 cards in their hand, activate one of these effects. Your opponent cannot draw during the next draw phase, or your opponent cannot activate spell or traps this turn. So this is sort of a mix between Cold Wave and Time Seal. but because of the exactly 4 card restriction on it, it's not really that good. Next up, we got Pole Position. This is a continued trap that caused ruling nightmares for a long period of Yu-Gi-Oh's history. This is a continued trap that says the face-up monster with the highest attack on the field is unaffected by the effect of spell cards. When Pole Position is removed from the field, destroy the face-up monster with the highest attack on the field. Now, there is potential for causing loops with this card, because if you've got equip spells on a monster that is then putting it to have the highest attack, and then Pole Position activates, reducing its attack because it doesn't gain the equip boost, and then it goes back and forth like that. That is very annoying. But realistically, this card is not good enough to see play unless you really, really want to piss off some judges. So next up, we've got Spiral Sphere Strike, and this card is a very continuous spell. It says, if Gaia the Fierce Knight, Swift Gaia the Fierce Knight, or Gaia the Dragon Champion you control, attack a defense position monster. Inflict piercing battle damage to your opponent. If Gaia the Dragon Champion inflicts battle damage with this effect, draw 2 cards, then discard 1 card. So this is sort of trying to attempt to make a sort of Gaia game plan, because Gaia is sort of a popular anime card that never really got its own support besides like Swift Gaia, but Swift Gaia was sort of just like a retrain of the original Gaia. But anyways, it's trying to give Gaia its own game plan. However, because of the specificity of the Gaia cards, the game plan is just hard to pull off because you're never going to be drawing into the Gaia cards. So I don't really think it's that good, but it is kind of interesting. If you want to go full in on the anime train and just play Gaias with these, then you can definitely do that if you want. Lastly, I'm going to close out this list by talking about Ultimate Insect level 5 and Silent Swordsman level 5, both of which are new level monsters that sort of pair with their sort of chain of level monsters that have been released steadily over the past couple sets and promos. So Ultimate Insect level 5 is the level 5 insect that if this card was special summoned by the effect of Ultimate Insect level 3 while it remains face up on the field, all your opponent's monsters lose 500 attack. During your standby phase, by sending this face up card to the graveyard, special summon 1 Ultimate Insect level 7 from your hand or deck. That card was not out at the time Flaming Eternity's release, but it is out by the time GOAT format rolls around, so don't worry, we'll be getting to that soon. Silent Swordsman level 5, on the other hand, is a level 5 warrior monster with 2300 attack, 1000 defense. It says, unaffected by your opponent's spell effects. During your next standby phase, after this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent by a direct attack, you can send this face-up card to the graveyard, special summon 1 Silent Swordsman level 7 from your hand or deck. So at this point in the game, it doesn't really make sense why you'd play this over Horus. But I do think that, Silent Swordsman level 3 being searchable off Rhoda is a reason to do that potentially. But, this card is... I'd say Horus is generally better than Silent Swordsman, but you'll see level 7 very, very soon. Now, before I leave, there are 2 normal monsters here that you might want to know about, Space Mambo and Insect Knight. Of course, while Insect Knight's battle prowess is unmatched, unfortunately, it doesn't really do anything unique here. I mean, I guess it is the level 4 monster with the highest attack and defense now, so... Well, Archfiend Soldier ties it, so realistically, it's between those 2 cards there. But I don't really think this card is that good. Even though it's got unmatched battle prowess, I don't think that you necessarily be playing it in a competitive deck over some other options. But maybe its unmatched battle prowess will prove me wrong in the future. I mentioned we'd be talking about Silent Swordsman level 7 very soon, and that's because it came out in a promo set for a video game. So there were a bunch of other promo cards released before GOAT format happened and that are legal in GOAT format, so I figured I'd talk about them here. Now, I'm not going to talk about all of them because, again, there were some normal monsters that didn't quite make the cut. But, these are realistically the cards that might matter in some way. First up is Silent Swordsman level 7. This is a level 7 light warrior monster that says cannot be normal summoned or set, must be special summoned by Silent Swordsman level 5, and cannot be special summoned other ways. Negate all spell effects on the field. So this is a bit worse than Horus the Black Flame Dragon level 8, which is the final form of Horus, which is sort of the most analogous sort of level archetype compared to this. But it is kind of decent. You negate all spell effects if you don't need your spells as much, and you might not if you've got just the 2800 attack beater that's attacking in. That can be pretty good. But Horus, of course, locks down only your opponent, not you. So I think Horus is a little bit better. Now, I will say these are light monsters, so they can pair with Chaos a little bit better, so that's nice. But realistically, I don't really think that this beats Horus if you're going for the LV strategy in the first place. Next up, we've got Kaiba Man here. Kaiba Man is a very fun card. It's just a level 3 warrior monster, 200 attack, 700 defense. You can tribute this card, special summon 1 Blue Eyes White Dragon from your hand. So you can search this off Rhoda. You can then bring out a Blue Eyes off it, so that's kind of neat. But realistically, if you're playing Blue Eyes, it's probably not going to be through Kaiba Man because you need some way to search out Blue Eyes, from deck to hand. Realistically, I'd say Paladin's probably a little bit better because Paladin brings it up from deck, so... I would go for that personally if I was going for Blue Eyes, but it's cool to have Kyberman as another option here. Next up, we got Mind Control, which is arguably the most important of these promos. I would say it's the most important of these promos. The normal spell that says target one monster your opponent controls until the end phase take control of that target, but cannot be declared an attack or be tributed. So you might be wondering, what's the point of doing that? Well, the point of doing that is that if your opponent is a set flip monster, then you can take control of it with Mind Control, flip it up, and get its flip effect for itself. And that comes up a lot in GOAT format. So it is very good to know about this card and also to play it in a variety of decks. So it does take skillful play to actually play this, but it is important to know about. Also, I just want to mention the hands look a lot like the hands are in card destruction to me. Not sure if that's coincidence, not sure if that's intended, but I'm very curious about what card destruction hands are doing. So let me know if you know more about that lore than I do. Moving on from the video game promos, we got some structure deck promos. Firstly, being Infernal Flame Emperor. This is a level 9? Is that it? Yeah, level 9 fire monster, Pyro. Attack 2700, 1600 defense. It says cannot be special summoned. When this card is tribute summoned, you can banish up to 5 fire monsters from your graveyard, destroy spells or traps on the field equal to the number of banished to activate this effect. Now, this is basically like a worse Mobius in my opinion, especially because you need fire monster in graveyard as setup already, and fire monsters are generally not that good. But it's just a lot of investment because it's also a 2 tribute monster that can't be special summoned, so you can't even bring this thing back once it's destroyed. So I don't really think it's that good. Very, very cool art though. Next up, we've got Ocean Dragon Lord Neo Daedalus. This is a level 8 Sea Serpent, 2900 attack, 1600 defense. Says this card cannot be normal summoned or set. This card cannot be spell summoned except by tributing 1 Levia Dragon Daedalus. You can send Umi you control to the graveyard to send all cards in both players' hands and on the field to the graveyard except this card. So this is kind of like a CED, except it sticks around, doesn't deal your opponent burn damage. So that's pretty cool if you can actually pull it off. However, it does take a lot of effort to do. Levia Dragon Daedalus is not searchable really. And so you need to have that on field already. That's also a high level monster. So even if you have a legendary ocean out, which does count as Umi, so you probably should be playing that, you know, you still have to tribute 1 monster to do that. And you also have to have this card in hand to do that. And this card's unsearchable as well. So realistically, it's a lot of hoops to jump through to get this card out on the field, but still very cool if you can actually pull it off and wipe the field and hands away. Next up, we've got some sneak peek cards. Firstly being Cyber Harpy Lady. This is a level 4 wind, winged beast, 1800 attack, 1300 defense. Says this card's name is always treated as Harpy Lady. So this is another copy of Harpy Lady that you can play. Again, you can only have 3 total of any card that's treated as Harpy Lady. At least any card that's always treated as Harpy Lady. So, you know, do you really want to play these over Harpy Lady 1? Maybe not. But it is kind of cool to see them continuing to make these Harpy Ladies if you want to play them. Next up, we've got Amazoness Chainmaster, the level 4 Earth Monster, 1500 attack, 1300 defense. Says when this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you can pay 1500 life points, look at your opponent's hand, then add 1 monster from their hand to your hand. This card can come up. There are certain decks that do want to play that, and there's certain cards that lean into this gimmick. You know, playing things like Mind Crush as well, and other things like that, to sort of take even more advantage off the hand knowledge. So this card can be pretty decent in those sorts of decks. However, those sorts of decks are generally not the best decks around. So, you know, realistically, this card won't really see much play, but it can come up occasionally. Next up, we got Embodiment of Apothis. This is a continuous trap. It says during the main phase, supposed to summon this card as a normal monster, Reptile Earth, level 4, 1600 attack, 1800 defense. This card is also still a trap. So this is a trap monster. Very weird set of traps, but it can be pretty neat. You know, you bring this out as an additional body. You can tribute this off. You can do a variety of things with it. So it's kind of cool in that regard. But, you know, I don't really think it sees much play in GOAT format. I don't really think there's like too much you can do with it in this format. So, you know, I don't think it will see that much play, but it is kind of cool to see that they're sort of continuing to innovate on this design space. Next up, we get into Tournament Pack 6, which did release some interesting cards. Firstly, we got Fusion Sage, which is a normal spell. It says add 1 polymerization from your deck to their hand. So if you're already playing a ton of polymerization, do you want a way to search it out? This is a way to do that. You know, I'm not necessarily sure if you'd play this if you're playing like less than 3 polymerization. I guess you can do it sort of like with a terraforming mindset where it does deck thin a little bit. So you could play like 2 polys, 1 Fusion Sage. But realistically, like if most fusion decks in this format do use just Fusion Gate to, you know, set up their fusion plays. So I'm not really sure if Fusion Sage will see much play in this format. It still is good to know about and have if you want to search out poly though. Next up, we got Clown Zombie. I'm only bringing this up because it is now the highest attack on a level 2 monster, and it's also a normal monster, and there was a set of cards in Ancient Sanctuary that sort of was trying to play around with the normal monsters that are level 2 or lower stars. So, you know, maybe this could play into those strategies. And also it looks really sick. It's from the anime, so that's kind of cool as well. So I figured I'd mention it here. Next up, for the last new card from the tournament pack, we've got Toon Cannon Soldier and Toon Table of Contents. Now, these are used in a couple different decks because Toon Table of Contents, what it can do is it searches out any Toon card from your deck to hand, including itself. So what you can do is you can play three Toon Table of Contents, use Toon Table to search another Toon Table, use Toon Table to search another Toon Table, use the last Toon Table, search out a Cannon Soldier. Cannon Soldier can fuel things like Last Will. It's also a body in case you need it for like Monster Gate or something like that. So there are a variety of things you can do with the Toon Table of Contents and Cannon Soldier combination there. But, you know, realistically, these cards are not fitting into a general like Toon strategy. Realistically, they're just being used for those sorts of decks. So they're not the most liked cards in the format, but they are kind of interesting. And I do think it's cool to see them continuing to try and play around with Toons a little bit. Now, Toon Cannon Soldier is basically the same thing as regular Cannon Soldier, except with some of the Toon conditions, so it can't attack the turn summoned. And also, if you control Toon World and your opponent controls no Toon monsters, it can attack directly. So, you know, it's kind of an interesting card. But, you know, I think mainly it's used in conjunction with Toon Table of Contents. There are some other new Toon monsters as well. Toon Goblin Attack Force, which again is basically just Goblin Attack Force with the same conditions, the Toon conditions that Toon Cannon Soldier has. And then Toon Mass Sorcerer, which again is the same thing as Goblin Attack Force and Cannon Soldier, but with the conditions of a Toon monster. So it's kind of cool to see them innovating with all these cards, toonifying different monsters, which was something that happened in the anime. So it is neat to see more of that happening. And lastly, for the new Toon support, we've got Toon Defense, which is a continuous strat that says when an opponent's monster declares an attack targeting a face-up level 4 or lower Toon monster you control, you can make the attack a direct attack instead. This isn't really the best. I mean, you've already got Astral's Body, I think that's the name of the card, where it basically allows you to turn any attack into a direct attack. So realistically, this card is just a more specific version of that, which, you know, you don't really need to play that sort of thing. But it's kind of interesting to see them making a Toon-specific version of that. So that's kind of cool. And these three cards were all in Dark Beginning 2, I believe. It was in one of the reprint sets where they had a couple new cards, and those were these. Now, the last card here was for a Duelist League participation thing, I think. But it is still legal, and that is Acid Rain. This is a normal spell that says destroy all machine monsters on the field. So this just wipes out your opponent if they're playing machine strategy, so that's kind of nice. But realistically, there aren't many like super good machine strategies in this format. But it can be used to clear things like Gatling Dragon or other just powerful machines like Jinzo. So a good card to know about if you are worried about those cards. And now to close out the video, we've got the Lost Millennium. And this set, oh boy, this set's something. You know, they really made some powerful sets in the DM era. And so they figured going into GX, you know, we've got to change that a bit. These sets were too powerful. Let's make a set that is absolutely terrible. And to be fair to the Lost Millennium, there are one card that is good, namely Brain Control. Brain Control is a normal spell that says pay 800 life points to target one face-up monster your opponent controls. They can be normal summoner set. Take control of that target until the end phase. Now, the can be normal summoner set thing was not there in GOAT format. So there's just any face-up monster your opponent controls, you can take control of Brain Control. So between Brain Control and Mind Control, you've got ways to take control of face-up monsters and set monsters as well. This card being very powerful, especially in Monarch strategies. You've got more ways to take your opponent's stuff and then tribute them off for Monarch. So that's very good. There is also one card that does see some play in like side decks against burn decks, and that is Death Wombat. It is a level 3 beast, 1600 attack, 300 defense. Says any damage to you from a card effect becomes 0. So if you can bring this out, a lot of burn decks do struggle to deal with that sort of thing. Beyond those two, pretty much every card in this set is bad. Which is kind of wild to think about because that's like a good 58 other cards in this set. But oh man, they are something. So let's start by going through them. And to start, let's just start with the anime because, you know, this was the first set of GX. So, you know, they had to introduce some new GX cards, namely the Elemental Heroes, which are used by Jaden. And, you know, he's the main character, he uses these cards, and he has the main character powers to actually make them work. Because in the beginning of the GX era, these cards were basically unplayable. There are some decks that you can make with him, like cheesy decks that do things, but realistically, they're not going to see much tournament success, and they're generally a lot worse than a lot of the other decks in the format. So let's start off with Elemental Hero Clayman and Elemental Hero Sparkman. These are the Elemental Heroes at this point with the best stats. They're both normal monsters, but Sparkman has 1600 attack, and Clayman has 2000 defense, so that's kind of nice. Also, all these Elemental Heroes are searchable off of Rhoda. So that's pretty good. If you need one or the other, you can have them to hand. And you might need one or the other because these are all fusion materials, basically. Basically, they turn into very powerful fusion monsters. Clayman and Sparkman turn into Thunder Giant, which is the better of the two Elemental Hero fusions released in GOAT format. The level 6 Warrior, 2400 attack, 1500 defense. This card must be fusion summoned, so you can't bring this out of something like Metamorphosis or Cyberstein or something like that. And once per turn, you can discard one card, then target one monster on the field with original attack less than the attack of this card, destroy that target. Now, that is a very restrictive effect. There are some things that you'd want to hit with this, but realistically, if a card has less attack than this card, you might as well just attack over it and not waste the card from hand. There are some weird edge cases where your opponent has a monster with a bunch of equip cards on it, and you can use this to destroy it. So that's kind of nice. But realistically, this card is not the best of the fusion monsters out there. The other fusion monsters made up of Burstrix and Avian here. And these cards are really bad on their own because they're very, very weak. Burstrix only has 1200 attack. Avian only has 1000 attack and defense. And they form Elemental Hero Flame Wingman. This is a fusion monster that's made with Avian and Burstrix. It must be fusion summoned. When this card destroys a monster by battle and sends to the graveyard, inflict damage to your opponent equal to the attack of the destroyed monster in the graveyard. So, this can deal a bit of burn damage, which is nice. But, it's only 2100 attack, and that's not really the best at getting over most things in the format, or at least most powerful threats in the format. And for the amount of investment that you have to put into this with your polys or your fusion gates, as well as the fusion materials that you make with them, this card is just generally not worth it. Now, if you want another way to get a specific elemental hero material to the field, then Hero Signal is that way. This says when a monster you control is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, spell summon one level 4 lower elemental hero monster from your hand or deck. So, if you do want to bring out one of these very weak monsters, you can do it with Hero Signal. So, that's another way to search out these cards, but realistically, that is not really the best. And if you're very, very scared of the Elemental Hero Menace because, let's face it, these cards dominated in the anime, then there is Mispolymerization, which is a normal trap that says activate only when a fusion monster is spell summoned, return all face-up fusion monsters to their respective extra decks. So, if you are really terrified of the Elemental Hero Menace, this is a great card to bring in against that. Although you could also just bring in other ways to stop fusion monsters, or just removal in general, because removal in general will deal with the fusion monsters, and also, your opponent's gone through all those resources to bring them out, so generally not that good. Of course, we're talking about other anime cards that Jaden used. Wing Karibo also premiered in this set. There's a level 1 fairy, 300 attack, 200 defense. Says if this card in the field is destroyed and sent to the graveyard for the rest of the turn, you take no battle damage. So it's kind of a neat sort of battle damage stopper, but Waboku, Threatening Roar, there's a lot of other options here that are probably better than Wing Karibo. But it's still cool to see this card being released. Another Karibo card, because Karibo is one of those cards that get iterated upon throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history, and this is really the first of those. Moving on to a different anime character, we've got the Ancient Gears, which Dr. Crowler used in the first episode of the GX anime, and also throughout the rest of the GX anime, but these gear monsters were all used in that first episode, so very cool to see them here. We got Ancient Gear Golem, level 8, Earth Machine, 3000 attack, 3000 defense. Says cannot be special summoned. If this card attacks, your opponent cannot activate any spell or trap cards until the end of the damage step. If this card attacks a defense monster, inflict piercing battle damage. So on the face of it, that seems really strong. 3000 attacks and nothing to scoff at. Also dealing piercing battle damage. Also preventing things like Sacred Armor from affecting it. Seems very powerful. Unfortunately, can't be special summoned. So that makes this card a lot worse because you can't bring this back from the graveyard after you've invested a lot of resources to bring it out, and then your opponent clears it. So unfortunately, because of that, it never really saw much play in this format. But it is still cool to see the boss of the Ancient Gears, and this was the cover card of the set. And what a cool card it is. Like, it looks really, really cool. Unfortunately, it's just not very that good. If you're playing an Ancient Gear Tribute monster, you might want to play Ancient Gear Beast instead. The level 6 Earth Machine, 2000 attack, 2000 defense, says cannot be special summoned if this card attacks. Your opponent cannot activate any spell or trap cards until the end of the damage step. Negate the effects of an opponent's monster destroyed by battle with this card, including the graveyard. So, this is very powerful. It can hit over something like Sintra Sherbin, and over something like DD War Lady, and not trigger their effects. So that's kind of nice. Unfortunately, it can't be special summoned just like Ancient Gear Golem, but it only requires one tribute, so that makes it a bit easier to actually bring out and pull off its effect. But it also does come with its own weaknesses. 2000 attack doesn't necessarily hit over a Great Crew Spy, which is a flip monster that a lot of people are playing, so it can't negate that. So, I think there are some things here that are flaws with this card, but it is still cool, and if you do bring it out, it can be annoying for your opponent to deal with. Next up, we get Ancient Gear Soldier, the level 4 machine, Earth Monster, 1300 attack, 1300 defense. So if this card attacks, your opponent cannot activate any spell or trap cards until the end of the damage step. So, this is sort of fitting with that general theme of negating spell or traps, or not negating, but preventing your opponent from acting them when it attacks. But unfortunately, the low attack on this card, no additional effects, make it pretty bad. Now, if we're talking about other anime cards, then I'm going to sort of go for an obscure one and go for Rush Up the Dark Being. This was used in the Capsule Monsters anime, which, was a 4Kids exclusive anime that, this was used by King Alexander at the end. Listen, there's all the cards in this set are bad. I'm trying to make transitions the best I can. So that's what I'm going with. This card was also in a video game. So, if you want general associated properties, then it's there as well. But This is a level 8 ritual monster fiend. It says this card can only be ritual summoned with the ritual spell card Final Ritual of the Ancients. Once per turn, by discarding one spell card from your hand, take control of one monster in your opponent's side of the field until the end phase. So that can be pretty good. Take control of your opponent's monster, go for a lot of damage. It also doesn't necessarily have to be a face-up monster, so you can take control of your opponent's sets, like with Mind Control, and so that can be very good as well. But realistically, the fact that you have to give back the card to your opponent is kind of awkward. And level 8 on a ritual monster is a lot to ask for because you have to have a lot of tributes for it. So I don't think this card is the best, but it's sort of interesting to tinker with. If you want to bring it out, Final Ritual of the Ancients is right here. It just ritual summons Reshef. So, it's not really anything special there. But for the other ritual monster in this set, there was one more, and it's actually a bit more of a relevant one. We've got Elemental Mistress Doriato. This is a level 3 spellcaster, ritual monster. It says this card can only be ritual summoned with the ritual spell card Doriato's Blessing, which is right here, which all it does, ritual summon Doriato. And this card, the attribute of this card is also treated as wind, water, fire, and earth. And the end of the text says while it's face up on the field. This card in GOAT format is also treated as that in the hand, which is important for a new deck that's sort of on the rise. You can check out Puig's channel if you want to see more of that. But it's like, basically you're using this in combination with things like Abyss Soldier and the like. And it also is a Light Engrave as well, so you can banish it for chaos stuff. So it's a very, very neat idea. And this card isn't really being played for like summing it out and like going for the 1200 attack or something like that, or going for a big Farin Kazaa play. But, it is kind of interesting to see it being used in that way. And so this card is somewhat relevant. So I will shout out that deck and definitely check out Puig's videos on the deck if you do want to see more of it. But realistically, beyond that application, this card is not really going to see much play. But speaking of attributes, we do have the introduction of another very beloved series of monsters in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game, and that is Win the Wind Charmer, Hita the Fire Charmer, Area the Water Charmer, and Ausa the Earth Charmer. These four go through quite a journey over their time, just sort of taming their pets and getting better at mastering the elements. They also have sort of Easter eggs there, so like Win has the Petite Dragon, Hita has the Fire Fox, or the Fox Fire, to avoid copyright claims, I guess. Area has Gigabyte, and Ausa has the Archfiend Marmot of Nefariousness. So these are all sort of classic normal monsters, or Foxfire, I guess, is not a normal monster, but it's still cool to see them all with these sort of Easter eggs here, and we'll be able to see their journey as they continue forward. Now, in this format, they're just flip monsters that target one of a given attribute that your opponent controls, and you take control of that target while this card is face up in the field. So Wind takes Wind, Fire takes Fire, Area takes Water, and Ausa takes Earth. So simple enough. And, it is kind of cool to see these, even though they're not really the best. You have to have, very, very targeted targets for these, because realistically, your opponent has to be playing either an Earth deck, a Water deck, a Fire deck, or a Wind deck, because you don't really see much play for monsters of those attributes outside of those decks. I mean, I guess Abyss Soldier is something you can use Area for, but if your opponent is Abyss Soldier or Tribe Infecting Virus, they're probably using the effects or something already. And also, this card can be beaten over by both of those, so it's not really that good in that regard as well. So these cards are not very that good, but I do think it will be cool to see them grow and how new cards sort of follow their story as time goes on. Now, speaking of Earth monsters, again, forgive my transitions here. There's a lot of bad stuff in this set, and it makes it hard to tie it all together. We've got a new series of Earth monsters, namely a bunch of rock monsters here, and they start with Guardian Statue. Guardian Statue is a level 4 rock. It says, once per turn, you can flip this card into face down position. When this card flips summoned, return one monster on your opponent's side of the field to his hand. Now, it's got 1800 attack, 1400 defense, and in fact, that is identical to Golem Sentry, which is also a rock, level 4 Earth monster with 800 attack and 1800 defense. So, realistically, you only play this card if you want to play 4 or more copies of Golem Sentry, which is kind of wild, because generally you don't necessarily want to play 4 or more copies of that. I mean, you might, given some of the other cards that are released here, which I'll talk about in a second, but realistically, that just seems like overkill, even if you are trying to make a deck like that. So, this card is not very good. It also can be beaten over relatively easily if it is set face down. And, that's a big flaw that's also shared by Medusa Worm, which is another rock Earth monster. 500 attack, 600 defense. One per turn, you can flip this card face down. If this card flips summon, target one monster your opponent controls, destroy that target. So this is a bit of a better effect than Guardian Statue, in my opinion, unless you're using something like Degenerate Circuit or the variety of other cards that might sort of benefit from bouncing your opponent's cards back to hand, which, we'll get to in a second, as I mentioned. But it sort of goes with the general theme of these rock monsters being able to sort of flip themselves down Pac-Man style. And the last of those is Moai Interceptor Cannon to the level 4 rock monster. 1100 attack, 2000 defense. This card doesn't have an additional effect when it's flipped face up. It just says 1 per turn. You can flip this card into face down defense. So it's just a 2k wall that you can flip face down, and it potentially pairs with something like, Shifting Shadows or Grave Oja or all the other cards that we'll discuss in a second. Before we discuss those, let's discuss some of the other rock monsters that get flipped up. We got Dummy Golem, level 2 Earth. Rock flip monster says flip, your opponent selects one monster they control, switch control of the selected monster in this card. And you might be saying, Ben, that's a flip monster. It doesn't really need to be flip summoned. Well, the issue with that is if this card flip face up, and destroyed by battle, then it won't actually trigger its effect because it will be destroyed. So you can't switch control of it. So essentially you need to protect this card and then flip summon it in order to pull off its effect, unless you're taking control of like a Sinister Serpent, I guess. But realistically, this card is also a flip summonable monster. And because you're giving it to your opponent, it obviously doesn't want to be flipped back down again. So I do count it as part of this sort of series of rock monsters that all want to get flip face up. Now, rocks aren't the only ones sort of doing this. We've also got Midshield Garden as a level 4 Earth Warrior effect monster. It says 1 per turn, you can flip this card into face down defense position. Negate the effect of any spell card that targets this one face down monster. At that time, flip this card into face up defense position. Now, this is basically like a worse Big Shield Gardener. Yes, Big Shield Gardener has the caveat where if your opponent attacks it, then it switches to attack mode. So like, this card doesn't have to do that, so that's nice. But realistically, 2600 defense, better than 1800 defense, and a bit more worth playing in my opinion. But I mean, it's cool to see them iterating on a previous card, as I mentioned before. But this is basically a Moai Interception Cannon, except it's not rock. So in my opinion, it's a bit worse. Although I guess you can search this out off of Rhoda. Next up, we've got Shifting Shadows. This is getting into these sort of support cards for these monsters that set themselves back down. It says once per turn by paying 300 life points, rearrange the face down defense position monsters in your main monster zones, then return them in face down defense position. So the idea is if you've got like a Moai Interceptor Cannons and Reduce Worm face down, then you can swap them around. Your opponent doesn't necessarily know which one to attack. And if they attack into Moai Interceptor Cannons and they don't have another monster to attack into the worm, you flip the worm next turn, pop that monster, set them both back down, and then reshuffle them again the next turn. So it's a bit of a convoluted strategy, and it does cost you 300 life points every turn. It's also a continuous spell, which generally aren't the best. But, it is something you can use to pair with these, I guess. And it works a little bit better than Impenetrable Formation, which is another continuous spell that you might think would work with this strategy, but it really doesn't. It says select one monster on your side of the field to activate this card. While you have 2 or more monsters on your side of the field and all the monsters on your side of the field are in defense position, the selected monster gains 700 defense. One of the selected monsters removed from the field, destroy this card. So basically the idea behind this is if you've got like one defense position monster that's face up, and you've got 2 others that are face down, you're like shuffling around those face down defensive monsters with Shifting Shadows, then you can also have one of your defensive monsters gain 700 attack, which is a big obstacle for your opponent to deal with. So, you might think like, oh, that goes great with this strategy. Well, the issue with that is that your opponent is going to attack the sets before they attack into the monster that is boosted by Impenetrable Formation. So if they clear your other 2 monsters, then Impenetrable Formation doesn't really do anything. Also, this only really works if the monster is face up in defense. I'm pretty sure. If it works on a set monster too, then, forgive me, because I guess this can be used to buff up like a Guardian statue or something to a point where your opponent doesn't necessarily have the tools to hit over it. But I feel like this only works on face-up defense position monsters. If anyone knows the ruling, let me know down in the comments below. But from my research, I couldn't find any rulings on this card, so I don't know if it actually can choose a face-down defense position monster. So my gut instinct would say no. But like if it does, then I guess it technically works with this strategy. But it's kind of like the worst way of doing it, because instead of playing it with like Guardian Statue, you could play a Golem Sentry, which most cards can't beat over anyways. I guess you could also play it with Golem Sentry to boost that up to 2500, but then you're playing around a very small number of cards. So I don't really think it's that good, but it is something that you can play if you want to, I guess. It's just really, really bad. Worse than Shifting Shadows, in my opinion. And it's sort of just like a card that seems to go with the strategy, but just completely fails if you think about it for more than a couple seconds. But, what do these cards have in common? They're both continuous spells. And, if we're talking about continuous spells, we got to mention Spell Stopping Statue. This is a counter trap that says activate only when your opponent activates a continuous spell card, negate the activation and the effect of the card, and destroy it. So finally, what everyone's been asking for, the card to negate continuous spells, also known as Mystical Space Typhoon, Heavy Storm, or Dust Tornado. Any spell and trap removal will basically negate a continuous spell for you, so you don't really need this card. It's kind of really bad. And the same applies to Royal Surrender, which is a counter trap that works the same way, but for continuous trap cards. Again, any spell and trap removal will deal with that the same way. You don't need Royal Surrender. You don't need Spell Stopping Statue. There are some weird edge cases where they would come up, and if you want more ways to deal with those cards, I guess you could play these. But these are just really, really bad counter traps. They basically don't do anything. They're like the counter traps that negated equip spells, which again, you know, you don't really need those. You just need spell and trap removal. So these cards are really bad, should probably see no play whatsoever. But if you really, really are terrified of continuous spells and traps, I guess you could play them. Getting back on topic with the rock monsters, we've got Grave Oja, and Grave Oja actually does go with the setting strategy. This says, while there's a face-down infested monster on your side of the field, no player can select this card as an attack target. Each time a monster on your side of the field is flip summoned, inflict 300 damage to your opponent. So the idea behind this is that it deals a bit of burn, in addition to, you know, the beneficial effects that you're gaining from things like Worm or Statue, or even if you got like Moai Interception Kittens up, it can turn that into burn damage every turn. So this card is very nice for the strategy. It actually does pair with the strategy, and if you can pull off that sort of lock and get consistent burn damage on your opponent every turn, it is kind of nice. And if you want to protect your set monsters even further, we've got Hierarchus Sphinx. Hierarchus Sphinx is a level 6 rock monster, 2400 attack, 1200 defense. Your opponent cannot select a face-down infested monster on the field at an attack target. So it protects things like your Medusa Worm, like your Guardian Statue, which are pretty weak. And so it can be pretty good in that regard. So I think that these are actually like good cards supporting this strategy. And I think that the Cryosphinx, while being a bit more specific, also sort of fits into that mold. It says, when a monster returned from the field to the owner's hand, the owner of the returned monster selects and sends one card in their hand to the graveyard. So basically this pairs with your Guardian Statue, with your Golem Sentry, and it allows you to rip cards out of your opponent's hand. Now, they do get to choose, which makes it a little bit awkward, especially if they draw into Send Serpent at any point. They need to Send Serpent, and then it's like, well, they get that back anyways next turn. But it is kind of cool to see this sort of pairing with the other rock monsters here, and also it is able to be summoned off Giant Rat, so it's kind of nice in that regard as well. Now, if you're really, really scared of this deck, don't worry. There are ways to stop it, namely White Ninja. White Ninja is a level 4 light warrior flip effect monster. Target one defensive monster on the field, destroy that target. Now, are there potentially other better ways that you can deal with those cards, like Nobleman of Crossout? Yes. But, you know, White Ninja is kind of funny, and it did release in the set. It is searchable off Rhoda, so you can pair with that. I mean, I don't know. This card's not good. You shouldn't play this card, but it is kind of funny to have here at least. Now, moving back to the rock monsters as opposed to ways to deal with the rock strategy, we've got Rock Bombardment. This is a normal trap that says send one rock monster from your deck to the graveyard, inflict 500 damage to their opponent. So that's kind of nice. It decked into a little bit, and it also sets up rock monsters in grave for the other boss that rock monsters received in this set, namely Mega Rock Dragon. Now, Mega Rock Dragon is a level 7 rock monster, question mark attack, question mark defense, and says cannot be normal summoned or set, must be special summoned from your hand by banishing any number of rock monsters from your graveyard. The original attack and defense of this card become the number of rock monsters banished to special summon it times 700. So if you can get a lot of rock monsters in graveyard, you can bring this out in a late game bomb. Deals a ton of damage if it gets through, and that is very, very powerful. So very, very cool to sort of see this as a actual powerful boss monster for this sort of, not like archetype, but just like type in general. And Rock Bombardment does pair very well with it. Another card that pairs somewhat well with it is Lost Guardian. This is a level 4 rock monster. 100 attack, question mark defense. Says the original defense of this card equals the number of your banished rock monsters times 700. So it's very similar to Mega Rock Dragon, where, you know, it benefits from your banished rock monster times 700. But there's a way that where if your opponent potentially clears your Mega Rock Dragon, you can have a ton of defense in the form of this. I don't really think it's that best because, you know, if you're going for Mega Rock Dragon, you're probably just going for, you know, lethal pushes or big damage pushes anyways. But it is something where, like, if the Mega Rock Dragon play fails, it does provide you with a little bit of backup. Now, moving on to different rock strategies, because this set had so many rock monsters, you know, rock monsters out the wazoo. We've got Mind Golem, the level 3 rock. It says when this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, inflict 500 damage to your opponent. It has 1900 defense, so it might not necessarily be the easiest to destroy by battle. But if you can deal that 500 damage to your opponent, that can be pretty decent, especially when you pair it with Minefield Eruption. This is a normal trap that says inflict 1000 damage to your opponent for each face-up Mind Golem on your side of the field. After that, destroy all face-up Mind Golems on your side of the field. Now, the 500 damage here only triggers when it's destroyed by battle. So I don't know why. I don't get it. You think that it would just say if it's destroyed, inflict 500 damage. So that way, you know, Minefield Eruption would actually trigger even more damage. And then it's like, oh, well, you have to play these specific cards, but they do a ton of burn damage. But as is, this can only deal at max 3000, which is not nothing, but like, why even have the Mind Golem effect here to deal damage if you're, I don't know. I don't get it. It's baffling to me, some of the design decisions in this set. But anyways, if you do want another way to deal burn, you can potentially use Mind Golem and Minefield Eruption here. Now, speaking about burn, there are some new, more generic burn cards in this set. They're all really bad, but you can play them. First is Nitro Unit. This is an equip spell that says equip only to a monster on your opponent's side of the field. When the equipped monster is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, inflict damage to your opponent equal to the attack of the equipped monster. So that's kind of neat. It's kind of like Ring Destruction at home, and only affects your opponent. However, again, just like with the other equip spells in this format, it can be dealt with by Dust Tornado, MST, etc. And if your opponent has a big enough monster where this damage is big enough to actually be a threat, then you're probably in a bit more dire straits, and you'd probably be wanting just general removal as opposed to Nitro Unit. So I don't really think this is the best, but it is kind of interesting. Maybe you could do a play with like Ring Destruction and Nitro Unit, where you like equip it with the Nitro Unit and then you destroy it with, Ring Destruction, so you're dealing double damage there. But realistically, I don't think this card is that good. Next up, we got Token Festival. This is a very interesting name of a card. Multiple puns crammed in there, but the card itself is not really that good. It says, when a token is special summoned, destroy as many tokens on the field as possible, and if you do, inflict 300 damage to your opponent for each token destroyed. Now, you can use this with things like Ojama Trio, or with your opponent's scapegoats, and etc. It's kind of nice in that regard. So I guess you can use it in a burn deck, but I don't really think it's the most optimal uses of your Geometry tokens to pair with this. I think that you'd be better off using things like Justice Urge or Secret Barrel or Gekiri Panda or things like that. So I don't really think this is the best, but it is kind of interesting to see them continuing to experiment with doing things with tokens, even if they're not the best so far. Lastly, for these burn cards, we've got Kozaki's Self-Destruct button. This is a normal trap that says inflict 1,000 damage to the player who destroyed the set card. So this is like an early version of Waking the Dragon. It's also kind of like Dark Coffin, etc., where it's just these traps that punish your opponent for destroying them. So, you could set a bunch of these and wait for your opponent's Heavy Storm to wipe out your back row and deal tons of damage to your opponent. That's kind of neat. But realistically, burn decks have better traps they can play instead. So I don't really think this card is the best. And if you're forced to use Heavy Storm to clear away your opponent's back row while you have this card set, then you're just dealing 1,000 damage to yourself and going minus at the same time. So I don't think this card is that good, but it is kind of funny to see. And it adds to the Kozaki lore. So there's that. Would you be surprised to learn that we are somehow not done with all the rock monsters in this set? Now we've got Monk Fighter, level 3 Earth rock monster. Battle damage to this card's controller from battle involving this card becomes 0. I don't know why this card's a rock. It would make sense as a warrior. I guess he's punching a rock. Maybe he becomes one with the rock. I don't know. All I know is that eventually, I'm pretty sure he becomes this Master Monk here, or the Master Monk is training him. I don't quite know. But Master Monk is a rock monster, level 5, 19 attack, 1,000 defense. So this card cannot be normal summoned or set. This card cannot be spell summoned except by tributing one Monk Fighter. This card can attack twice during the same turn. So, the payoff for having this weak rock monster Monk Fighter is you get to bring out this weak monster Master Monk that can attack twice. So realistically, it can do 3,800 damage potentially. That's something, I guess. There are also some cards to pair with it. But realistically, you could just get the same effect with Double Attack. Double Attack is a normal spell that released in this set. So discard one monster card from your hand to the graveyard. So one monster on your side of the field with a lower level than the discard monster. The selected monster can attack twice this turn. So, you can get the same sort of effect with this and also having less bricks, I guess. And you can even manipulate the cards in your hand to make this card a bit better. Like if you do Level Conversion Lab on a Sinister Serpent, Level Conversion Lab is a normal trap that says select one monster in your hand and show it to your opponent, then roll a 6-sided die. If the result is 1, send the selected monster to the graveyard. If the result is 2 to 6, the level of the selected monster becomes equal to the result until the end of this turn. So if you do want to pair this with Double Attack, you can. I'm just trying to reach to find some application for these awful cards. I mean, the typical application of Level Conversion Lab, I'm pretty sure, would be you have a high level monster in hand, use this card to reduce the level a bit to 4 or lower, so that way you can normal summon it out. So that's kind of nice there. But, realistically, the odds of that are not really the best. It's kind of like, because you've got 2 through 4, and then you've got 5 and 6, and then 1 sends it to hand. So basically, you've got 50-50 of being able to use this to bring the card out this turn. I mean, you don't really have the best odds of being able to buff it up to a level where you can double attack this turn. But I don't know. This card is not very good. Any card that relies on chance in this way, and it's also kind of a minus, it's just not the best card in the world. So interesting card for sure, but I don't really think it will see much play. Now, back to the Monk Fighter and Master Monk, because, oh yes, there is more that goes with these two monsters, along with Chusuke, the Mouse Fighter that I mentioned in the last set. I mentioned that there will be more specific cards for it. The time for those cards is now. Starting with Lone Wolf. This is a continuous trap. It says activate only if the one and only monster on your side of the field is Chusuke the Mouse Fighter, Monk Fighter, or Master Monk. That monster cannot be destroyed as a result of battle and is unaffected by any of your opponent's monster effects. That may sound pretty good on the face of it. However, then you realize that you're stuck with Monk Fighter or Master Monk or Chusuke the Mouse Fighter, all of which are pretty bad. So, do you want to make that trade? Probably not. Also, it's only unaffected by monster effects, not unaffected by spell or traps. So your opponent likely has a variety of ways to deal with it that way. So I don't really think this card is that good. We've also got Legendary Black Belt here. Equip spell. It says equipped only to Chusuke the Mouse Fighter, Monk Fighter, or Master Monk. When the equipped monster destroys your opponent's monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, inflict damage to your opponent equal to the defense of the destroyed monster. So I guess that can come up potentially if you're using it with Master Monk. You can get in a ton of damage by attacking into your opponent's defensive monsters, which they're clearly bringing defense because they're so afraid of the prowess of Master Monk. So you get to punish them for doing that. But again, it's kind of a convoluted setup, and you really do need Master Monk to make it work because Monk Fighter and Chusuke probably aren't going to do it for you. Next up, we got Kaminote Blow. This is a normal spell that says activate only if there is at least one face-up Chusuke the Mouse Fighter, Monk Fighter, or Master Monk on your side of the field. Destroy the monsters that battled with these monsters on your side of the field this turn at the end of each damage step. So, if you've got Master Monk up and you attack multiple times in your opponent's stuff, you can destroy them with the effect. But realistically, this only comes up if your opponent has defensive monsters that can withstand the incredible fighting prowess of Master Monk. I guess this can also come up if you've got a Master Monk and a Monk Fighter on your field and you use Kaminote Blow to, crash the Monk Fighter into an opponent's monster that's stronger than the Master Monk, and then you get to destroy that monster and then attack twice with Master Monk. But it's just a lot of convoluted stuff to actually get this being pulled off. And also, I think if you want to do that sort of thing, you're probably better just using Gift of the Martyr, which even has Monk Fighter in the art. So even the cards know that Gift of the Martyr is the better way to do this than Kaminote Blow. But Gift of the Martyr basically says send one monster you control to the graveyard, then target one face-up monster you control. It gains attack equal to the original attack of the sent monster until the end of the turn. So that is generally better if you want to use Master Monk to fuel the Master, or Monk Fighter to fuel the Master Monk, than Kaminote Blow. I mean, I know Kaminote Blow has the Millennium Shield here, so the idea is you're able to attack over that, but you can attack over that using Gift of the Martyr anyway. So, I don't know. Oh my goodness. But, very strange stuff. I mean, Gift of the Martyr doesn't have to be used in the strategy. Gift of the Martyr is a generic card that you can use in any strategy, although Gift of the Martyr is kind of just a bad card because it is basically using two cards to buff up the attack of one monster until the end of the turn. So that might get you a 2-for-1 trade because you attack him with that monster into an opponent's monster they couldn't beat over before. But realistically, there's a lot of hoops to jump through for something that could get stopped with something like a Sakuretsu Armor. So I don't really think it's that good. But it's kind of interesting here that even the cards know that this is a better card than Kaminote Blow. Next up, since we're talking about specific cards, that basically mention one card in the format, which is basically these cards, although they do mention three. Realistically, it's very, very specific, too specific, in fact. We've got King of the Skull Servants. Now, eventually this card would be a bit more generic because there would be more Skull Servants released that have the name Skull Servant. But right now, the only card in this format with the name Skull Servant is Skull Servant. And so this card is not really the best here. It's a zombie, level 1, 0 attack, or 0 defense and question mark attack. So the original attack of this card is the combined number of King of the Skull Servants and Skull Servant in your graveyard times 1,000. When this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you can banish one of those King of the Skull Servants or Skull Servant from your graveyard to special summon this card. So if you do manage to get a ton of Skull Servants or Kings in the graveyard, then this card can get a ton of attack. However, doing that requires you to play a bunch of Skull Servants. If you do just want to play the King itself, then the max attack you can get is 2,000. So realistically, if you want to make that worth it, you kind of have to play more than just the King. So you have to play the base vanilla Skull Servants, the level 1 terrible monster that is just a 300 attack point monster. And that's not really the best. So I don't really think this card is good right now, especially because you don't really have ways to bin them to grave. You don't have Painful Choice anymore, so you can't use that with this. So realistically, this card is not good at present. It will get better eventually, but not in GOAT format. And speaking of just very specific cards, we've also got Battery Charger. And why do I say this specific? I mean, it says pay 500 life points for some one Battery Man monster from your graveyard. The reason I say it's specific is because the only Battery Man monster legal in this format is Battery Man AA. So realistically, this is a reborn for one specific monster. And the monster itself is not really the best. It says if all Battery Man AAs on your side of the field are in attack position, this card gains 1,000 attack. For each Battery Man AA on your side of the field, if all Battery Man AAs are on your side of the field are in defense position, this card gains 1,000 defense for each Battery Man AA on your side of the field. So Basically, the idea is this is very similar to a King of the Soul Servant situation where you play these 3 cards and you can potentially buff it up to a 3k monster, which is a little bit better than King of the Skull Servants in my opinion. And also you'll have like 3 of them on your field too. So like that way, you know, you can go for a big OTK. You could also potentially use the thing with machine duplication as well to get out those other 2 Battery Man double A's. Actually, you can't because it does count itself. So yeah, just be 1,000 attack. So you can't use machine duplication for this. So yeah, I don't really know. It's a bit tough to actually assemble all the Battery Man double A's. I guess you got the Charger, but you know, Charger for 1 double A, and then you summon on another, that's just 2,000 attack on these monsters, which isn't really the best. So I don't really think this card's that worth it. But it is something, I guess. It is sort of a strategy built to. Charger will get more generic as more Battery Men come out, and more Battery Men will come out in future formats, but right now, this card is just sort of a specific, like, too specific gimmicky combo. So, you know, something that you can build if you want, but it's very, very tough to actually pull off. Especially because this is actually a Thunder. It can't work with machine duplication anyways. Okay, now that I've calmed down a little bit from Konami's just bizarre design decisions, let's talk about another specific monster, which is Ultimate Insect level 7. Now, this is specific because it requires you to have Ultimate Insect level 5, although I guess you could just normal summon this out naturally. The level 7 monster that's 2 tributes, not really the best there. Says if this card was just summoned by the effective Ultimate Insect level 5, while it remains on the field, all of your opponent's monsters lose 700 attack and defense. So that can be pretty good. You know, you get a big monster out, you weaken your opponent's monsters. So that can be a bit tough for your opponent to deal with, although it doesn't have protection, so your opponent can just use like Sacred to Armor or any variety of cards to clear this thing. It's so cool, cool boss monster. One of the coolest insect boss monsters at this time. Although if you're talking about other cool insect boss monsters, Millennium Scorpion is another one that you might want to consider. The level 5 insect, 2,000 attack, 1,800 defense says each time this card destroys one monster on your opponent's side of the field by battle, send it to the graveyard. This card gains 500 attack. So basically, the idea is that you attack over your opponent's monster with this. It gets bigger and bigger. Your opponent gets more and more scared. They can't do anything to stop this, and then it gets in for a ton of damage. Realistically, this card is going to get cleared before it really deals too much damage, but it is kind of cool to see. And I think it's a cool insect boss. I like the flavor of it, so I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. Next up, just speaking of just generically cards in this format, I don't know. I've given up on transitions at this point. We just got the last couple cards in this set here. So let's start with DD Survivor. DD Survivor is a card that sees play in later formats and can see some play here. It's a level 4 warrior monster, 1,800 attack, 200 defense. Says during the end phase, if this card was banished while face up on the field, this turn, special summon this banished card. This effect can only be activated once per turn. So the idea is if your opponent's playing things like DD Assailant or DD Warrior Lady, you can use DD Survivor to sort of clear those cards, then bring it back. That's kind of nice. However, that's a very, very niche application. And unfortunately, like, it doesn't come up all too often in this format. There are some decks that do play this on the side, though, so you can play it there. If you want to sort of combo with this a bit more, you've also got Card of Sanctity. This is a normal spell that says banish all other cards you control in your hand, minimum 1 from each. Draw until you have 2 cards in your hand. So if you've got just the DD Survivor and Card of Sanctity, you can summon the DD Survivor, activate Card of Sanctity, basically turn that into a pot of greed, and then you get back the DD Survivor in the end phase. However, Card of Sanctity is just a very, very specific card, so I don't really think it's that worth it. It generally is always a minus, so I don't really think it's that good. But it is kind of cool that this card's here. It was an anime card, which is cool. But yeah, it's just generally not that good. Moving on to the last 2 cards, we get Graveler. Normal Trap says turn the top card of your opponent's deck face up when your opponent shuffles their deck. When your opponent draws the face-up card, immediately send it to the graveyard. So it's like a delayed 1-for-1 removal thing, except your opponent will know it's coming. You'll know it's coming. I guess it's also kind of like a time seal for that turn when the card shows up eventually. But also, you know, if it's a card that can just be searched off something like Rhoda, your opponent can stop that effect by just searching it out with Rhoda. I don't know. It's just a weird card overall. I don't know if it's that good, but it's kind of neat. And if it does come up, it's kind of neat. But like, yeah, it's just too random for my taste. And also it might not even come up at all if that card is just in the bottom part of your opponent's deck, or it's just not very good, or it's like Sinister Serpent. There are many, many things that can punish this card. So I don't really think it's that good. And lastly, if we're talking about just getting more information of what's in your opponent's deck, we've also got Pikaru's Second Sight. The normal trap that says until your opponent's second end phase, your opponent shows you all cards they draw before adding them to your hand. I mean, if you want that knowledge, sure, you can go for this card. I think the Deck Devastator Virus is a little bit better because then you're actually dealing with some stuff that your opponent might have in hand, and you're getting full knowledge of their other cards in hand. But I guess if you really, really want to know exactly what they're drawing, you can use this if you want. I mean, this card is so bad. There's so many cards that are strictly better than this card, but it is just so bad. And that's going to conclude, I think, what is arguably the worst set of Yu-Gi-Oh! So far that I've covered. I can't really think of a set that's worse than this that I've featured on the channel so far. If you can think of one, let me know. But this set is just abysmal. Like, oh my goodness. There's like one good generic card here, a good side deck card potentially, a neat strategy that you can try out, but realistically it's not very good. You got the basis of Elemental Heroes, which is cool, but generally the set is bad. But luckily, we're going into a format that is really, really good because GOAT format is widely regarded as one of the best formats in the game's history. So I'm excited to explore it. I've got some very special plans coming up for GOAT format. So if you want to see those, subscribe to the channel and you'll be able to be notified when those videos come out. And it would be really mean a lot to me. I'd like to reach 1,300 subscribers by the end of the month. And I believe we can do it, but I'll need your help to do so. Also, if you have some thoughts about these cards that I've covered, maybe I sort of missed an edge case, or you've got some arguments for why a card is worse than I presented it, then let me know down in the comments below. I look forward to discussing with you all as always. And if you want to play games in GOAT format or any other format that I featured on the channel, then definitely head on over to the YGO from Zero Discord server. I know there are also other places that you can play GOAT format, but if you want any other formats that I've featured, then that's the best place to go. Also, if you want to support me directly, I do have a Patreon, link in the description down below. And if you join the Patreon, you'll be shouted out in these videos. So big shout outs to Tyler Compton, GMYFS, Dump Truck, Porkchop Coon, Rincewind, and Bren Donker. It really means a lot to me that you support me all this way. And it encourages me to make more videos like this. So I hope you enjoyed as always. I know it was a bit of a long one, but I'm excited to jump into GOAT format with y'all. And until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.